My name is Daniel Joseph MacArthur Seal. I'm a research fellow at the British Institute at Ankara, and with great pleasure I've been part of organising this conference. I'd like to thank USAC especially for hosting us and for playing such an important role in helping organise this event. And before we begin our first panel, I'd like to invite Özlem Sandberg, who's the president of USAC, to make introductory remarks for you all. So please.
Thank you, Chairman. Ambassadors, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished scholars and historians. It's of course a very great pleasure to welcome you all here today to this conference, which is entitled Turkey and Britain from Enemies to Allies, which is being jointly organized by the British Institute at Ankara and USAC. This conference is a first for us in many ways. The first time we at USAC have helped organize an international conference on history, as opposed to the current scene. The first such conference too, organized in Turkey by the British Institute, though I hope it will not be the last, and the first to focus specifically on the important topic of British-Turkish relations in the 20th century. As a former ambassador to London, I naturally feel a strong interest in the subject. But the history of the relations between Britain and Turkey is a fascinating and important topic in its own right. We continue to be one of each other's main close allies, trading partners and most supportive friends inside both NATO and the European Union. This is something which dates back many years, and I do not expect to see it change. It's a friendship which we take it for granted. This seminar will be a wonderful opportunity to look in detail at how it came into being and why it has been so beneficial to both sides, and thus why it will endure. There are many pillars which underpin our good working relations, the alliance between Britain and Turkey. One of the most important of those pillars has long been the British Institute at Ankara, which we welcome here today as the co-organizers of this conference. The British Institute has been working in Turkey now for nearly 7 decades. It has helped train many scholars and fostered research in Turkey and its history, geography, people and culture. Its chairman, Sir David Logan, is a distinguished former diplomatic and Turkey specialist and a firm friend of this country. So we at USAC were delighted indeed and deeply honored when he asked us to be co-sponsor and host of this remarkable event. We were even more impressed when he shared details with us of the impressive and distinguished team of speakers who have traveled from the UK, from Istanbul and elsewhere to be with us today to talk about the relationship between Britain and Turkey in the period we are considering. It's a remarkable, strong and diverse team, and I'm sure that the papers will be a landmark in the academic study of British-Turkish relations when they appear in print in due course. They will foster a deeper understanding of how strong the forces are which unite us and help our two great countries to work together for a better world, one in which security and prosperity prevail. That should give us confidence for the future. I do not need to remind you that all of us, Turkey, Britain, the European Union, are living through challenging, indeed dangerous times. We are combating forces which are unpredictable and destructive. It's important, vital, in fact, that we learn to keep our courage and good sense of and work together. What we can learn from the study of history, I think, and particularly from a gathering like this conference, is that this is not an entirely new or unprecedented experience. Every age has its own darkness and risks, and it may even be that previous generations faced greater threats and more terrible dangers than we do, then did not have the technology, the skills, and the knowledge that we do today. Yet ultimately things went right, and they did so because we are able to understand each other, cooperate, and make our way forward. That was true in the 19th century, which we are not considering in this particular conference, but it was a period of tremendous vital cooperation between Britain and Turkey. In the Crimean War, and again in the Turco-Russian War of 1877-78. Then in the face of the successive challenges, first of Nazism and then of communism in the Cold War, we learned how to create new partnerships based on new realities and new perceptions, and they helped make the world in which we live today. But at every stage, knowledge of the past, appreciation of past achievements, and recognition of missed opportunities and unnecessary mistakes helped. Our American friends and allies, of course, study the past closely when designing their policies, and I think they are right to do so, for it brings the depth of policy-making perceptions, which otherwise is impossible. To be intellectually fertile, ideas and views have to be tested and improved where necessary. Our Turkish and British participants are coming from different milieux, perhaps sometimes different assumptions, so the interchange of ideas between them will be fascinating and, I hope, creative. We have many insights to share with each other. This is not just a history conference, it's really also an historic occasion. Let's hope it will be just the first of many. So it is with exceptional pleasure that I hand you over to the chair, Dr. Sil, for this session. And welcome to Ankara, and welcome to, I hope, to a lively and exciting exchange of ideas and perception. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I call on the first panel now to join me so we can begin our first session. That's Altay Cengizer, Camille Cole, and Peri Recepi. Our first panel is going to focus on Anglo-Ottoman relations in the lead up to the First World War and the nature of the relationship at the outbreak of that war. First, Camille Cole will give her paper. Camille, I met actually in Cambridge while she was a graduate student. Since then, she's gone on to Yale, where she's writing her PhD thesis on environmental and technical history in Iraq and Iran. She's arrived presently from Jordan, where she's the Casa Arabic Fellow in Amman. And she recently, or rather, she has a very shortly forthcoming paper in the Journal of Social History on the topic of precarious empires, social and environmental history of steam navigation on the Tigris. So, please take us away, Camille Cole.
Can I go for it, or? Hi everyone. I want to start by thanking Daniel and the rest of the organizing team for putting together this workshop, and thanks to all of you for being here. Today I'm going to talk about the role of global economic networks in British informal imperialism in Ottoman Iraq. And I'm actually, despite the topic of the conference, going to be going back into the 19th century a little bit. Specifically, I'm going to look at two enterprises, the Lynch Brothers Steamship Company on the Tigris, and the consortium which built the Hindia Barrage on the Euphrates, as expressions of two different forms of economic imperialism. I'll explore the global trading and capital networks that were standing behind each project. British informal imperialism in Iraq, though, was not only shaped by these established trading and capital networks. During the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire was invested in its own efforts to incorporate Iraq and the rest of the Gulf region more securely back into the imperial fold, which made them particularly suspicious of British activity in southern Iraq and shaped the possibilities for economic intervention in the region. The diplomatic controversies which emerged over each project centered on the relationships between political and economic power. Those relationships and the changing goals for them espoused, particularly by the British side, will be the focus of this paper. And I'll also argue that the two projects representing these two different kinds of global economic network were essentially unable to coexist fruitfully because of the tense nature of Anglo-Ottoman relations and the defensive Ottoman stance towards its Gulf periphery. So I'll start with the Lynch Brothers and the Euphrates and Tigris Steam Navigation Company, or actually a little bit earlier with Francis Rawdon Chesney and his 1836 steamship mission down the Euphrates. Chesney's mission to open up a quote-unquote Euphrates route to India was a failure in terms of Indian defense, but had some important commercial results. After Chesney left Iraq, Henry Bloss Lynch was appointed to command his remaining steamship and Indian diplomatic relations in what they called Turkish Arabia. At Lynch's urging, his younger brothers Stephen and Thomas came to Baghdad and founded an import-export business, one of a group of new merchant enterprises encouraged by Chesney's report of favorable trade conditions. The Lynches then started running their first steamship on the Tigris in 1861. To do that, they in many ways had to distance themselves from the community of expatriate merchants in which they previously participated in order to claim the legacy of the Chesney mission for themselves solely. They built their claim to be able to run steamships on the Tigris on a particular interpretation of the Fadrons granted to Chesney in 1836 and the follow-up letters given to his successor, their brother Lynch, in 1841 and 1846. And I can go into that later if you're interested. Because the Lynch brothers faced a lot of trouble attracting business, particularly as they started out, they essentially had to create the trade that their ships would carry, and they did that by linking themselves into a larger developing network of merchants and merchant shipping in the Indian Ocean. The Lynch brothers developed a symbiotic relationship with the import firm Gray Mackenzie, which was based in Basra, and as of 1870 held the contract to import coal for the Lynch ships. So they had a sort of symbiotic relationship. Gray Mackenzie was also affiliated with Gray Paul in Bushehr in Iran, and with Gray Dawes, which ran steamships in the Gulf. Gray Dawes was also dependent on the Lynch steamships, as their own ships had to stop in Basra every week, as they operated the Indian mail contract on behalf of the larger British India Steam Navigation Line. Both Gray Dawes and Gray Paul had also acted as agents for the British India Line since the 1860s, and British India was more than just a merchant shipping line. In addition to being one of the most powerful agents of British-led globalization and economic imperialism, it also functioned as a merchant marine and auxiliary to the Indian Navy in times of war. So the Lynch brothers were part of one of the most important experiments in British informal imperialism in this period. In general, the maintenance of small merchant communities around the world through the award of shipping and mail contracts was seen as a cheap and easy way to maintain British influence, and this was the fundamental assumption underlying imperial support for the Lynch Company, although it can be debated whether or not that was actually the case in Iraq. The postal contract that bound the Lynch brothers into this broader network of merchant shipping and British influence also serves as a window onto political and economic power and British-Ottoman relations. The Lynch brothers were very reliant on the postal subsidy, both financially and as a confirmation of their legitimacy, not just to operate, but to operate as an arm of the British Empire. Whenever they got into their not infrequent disputes with the Ottoman state, the company called on both Delhi and London for help, usually invoking the postal contract. In 1883, for example, the company argued in its appeal that both the trade they fostered and the mails they carried were, quote, vital interests to be protected by the British state. Both the Lynches and British diplomats in Iraq consistently referred to the Lynch ships as mail steamers, pushing the limits of Ottoman tolerance on the assumption that the state wouldn't interfere with the official business of these ships. But in some ways, the Lynches dug their own grave. Their repeated invocations of the mail subsidy as evidence of their vital service to the British Empire provoked greater scrutiny of the actual nature of that service. Starting at the beginning of the 20th century, the Lynches faced numerous complaints about their schedule, basically that the ships were often late and missed the mail connection. The company offered up a variety of excuses: low water, Arab attacks, fog. But British consular officials were inclined to think that the company simply prioritized its commercial business over its government cargo, taking too much cargo, for example, which brought in more money but slowed the ships down considerably. Consul Newmarch, writing in 1905, argued that their profit-seeking behavior was not a problem in itself, but became a problem in the context of the Lynch's repeated calls for strong government support, both diplomatic and monetary. When the mail contract actually came up for renewal in 1914, the Lynch Company was bold enough to request an increase in the mail subsidy, arguing that the barges they now towed were increasing their running expenses. The discussion was postponed by the outbreak of World War I, but the contours of the discussion about the appropriate relationship between government and commerce in the extension of British influence in Asia suggest that this kind of arrangement was more than just a cheap and easy method of avoiding military intervention. The Lynch brothers clearly occupied a position of relative power in their negotiation with the British state, partly due to their success in appropriating the mantle of the Chesney expedition. Other actors, including the Ottoman government, often referred to the Lynch brothers and the British state in Iraq as if they were identical. Though the British diplomats tended to be somewhat annoyed by this tendency, it's clear that they also saw the Lynch brothers as performing a valuable service. As late as 1908, after many of the problems with the Lynch business had come to light, George Lloyd and the Board of Trade were still advocating for similar arrangements to be made elsewhere around the Gulf in order to preserve British influence from the increasing threat of German trade. This perception often led the government to cave to Lynch's demands. In 1912, for example, the consulate supported Lynch's campaign to be allowed a third steamship against their better judgment. The government was worried about provoking the Ottomans, but Lynch argued that a third ship would allow them to travel faster with the same amount of cargo and thus deliver the mails on time. They did get the third ship, but they did not start delivering the mails on time. It's important, I think, to note the shifts over time in the ways the Lynches justified their project to the government. Well, in the 1880s, they argued that both their commercial and postal activities were vital to British government influence. By the early 20th century, the government had come to see those two functions as contradictory. So we see a shift after that to a more strictly legalistic focus on the postal contract itself and on the legal basis for the Lynch presence in Iraq. This may be partly because of the shift to a different kind of economics as the basis for government intervention, which I'll address later in talking about the barrage. But throughout, the Lynches relied on the postal subsidy as a marker of their position internal to the British Empire. But British postal service was not just an intra-imperial issue. It created problems over the years with the Ottoman government, basically as it was seen to usurp Ottoman sovereignty. The local government made several attempts to stop or at least control the mail service, threatening repeatedly to force all mails to be carried on Ottoman ships, and extracting an 1882 concession from the Indian government that parcel mail could be treated like cargo and searched. In a seeming contradiction, the Ottomans also sometimes argued that the Lynch ships ought to be forced to carry the Ottoman mails for free. But I think what all these policies have in common are attempts to assert sovereignty, whether over the mails, which was a component of the modernization projects of the Tanzimat and Hamidian states, or over foreign companies like Lynch. The issue of the postal subsidy for the Ottomans was often raised in the context of the dubiousness of the Lynch permissions to be operating on the Tigris at all, which came up every time the Lynch brothers requested an extension to their service, like the third steamship I mentioned earlier. The local government was very resistant to these extensions to the Farman, even though they insisted that the Farman did not even apply to Lynch in the first place. Generally, they granted extensions to the service only for emergencies, like the towing of barges to carry grain during a famine, which were then never revoked. Essentially, the Lynch brothers were able to leverage gaps and inconsistencies in both the British and Ottoman positions to advance their own commercial ambitions. They were much bolder about deploying British imperial might than the state itself was, knowing that the state basically felt that, at least in Iraq, felt that it couldn't do without them and would support them. The Ottomans, on the other hand, were never able to muster the diplomatic might to get rid of the Lynches entirely, and it's not actually clear that that would have been desirable, given the ease with which the state could at least tax cargo traffic carried on steamers. I'm going to turn now to talking about the Hindia Barrage and the nexus of investment capital which stood behind it. I won't go into detail about the reasons the barrage was being built, though I can later if you're interested, but essentially it was fulfilling important local governing priorities for the Ottoman government and found enthusiastic supporters among a cohort of British Indian irrigation engineers who saw Iraq as a biblical landscape ripe for scientific regeneration on the mold of Egypt or the Punjab. The Ottoman government built a series of temporary dams on the Euphrates over the course of the late 19th century, but the barrage project was really started after the Committee of Union and Progress came to power in 1908, and committed itself to modernization projects, including the Hindia Barrage and the broader scientific irrigation of Iraq. Significantly, the CUP was much more favorable than previous governments to the introduction of British investment capital in the empire, a development the British seized on in an attempt to regain lost ground against the Germans, who had the Baghdad Railway contract, and the French, who dominated the funding structures at the Ottoman Bank. The Ottomans first hired William Wilcox, an irrigation engineer who'd been a tireless promoter of regenerating Iraq, and who'd come up with a comprehensive irrigation plan for the region. But his employment fell apart after just a few years, and construction on the barrage was turned over to a consortium consisting of the National Bank of Turkey, a British investment house based in Istanbul, and the Sir John Jackson Company, an international contracting and construction engineering firm. This consortium, which collaborated on a number of infrastructure projects across the Ottoman Empire, was emblematic, I think, of a different kind of international network and a different kind of economic influence than that which the Lynch brothers were part of. The National Bank was another product of the post-1908 Anglo-Ottoman thaw. It was founded at the request of the Ottoman government, but also with explicit backing from the British state, which hoped that it could compete with the Ottoman Bank. The bank was seen by British diplomats as crucial not only in supporting British interests within the Ottoman state, but also in providing the financial assistance which could potentially prevent a breakup of the empire. I mean, that may have been a sort of wild imagination on their part, but that's what they thought. The Jackson Company, which was partnered with the bank on the barrage project, was involved in construction projects all over the world, from the base of Tower Bridge in London to the Arica-La Paz Railway in South America to the new harbor in Singapore. They were not the only firm doing this kind of work, and in fact there were another number of other British and German consortia competing for the Hindia contract. This consortium, I think, was representative of a new vision for the relationship between economic and political power. Instead of trade, the idea behind the National Bank and British support for companies like Jackson was capital investment and the transformation of physical infrastructure as the basis for political influence. This was actually an attitude shared by the Ottomans, who looked to infrastructure, particularly in peripheral regions like Iraq and the Hijaz, as a means to stake claims to sovereignty and to reincorporate marginalized regions back into the imperial mainstream. For the British, investing in the Hindia Barrage was never completely divorced from trade, as it was imagined that irrigation would increase export possibilities and create new room for imports by enriching the country overall, but this was really a secondary concern. Primarily, they were interested in entrenching British investment by making themselves indispensable to subsequent projects. This forward-looking attitude was central to the disagreements over funding, which were the crux of the Ottoman-British conflict over the barrage. There were two primary British factions with different views on how to fund construction on the barrage, and, relatedly, what the endpoint of British involvement in Iraq should be. The first faction argued that the Ottomans should not be allowed to take out any loans in order to fund hydraulic projects, as they would then lose control over those projects, which should really be used to prop up provincial and imperial revenues through agricultural increase. The second faction, led largely by Lorimer in the Baghdad consulate, argued that British aims would be best served by having the Ottomans meet funding gaps on the barrage by providing surplus revenues directly from the Indian government, using debt to guarantee permanent British involvement in the region. Both factions agreed that the British should continue to be involved in hydraulic and social engineering in Iraq, with even those against Ottoman debt essentially arguing that British advisors should be retained permanently or semi-permanently to help with post-construction projects like canal management and the adjustment of land tenures, despite a lack of evidence that the local government in Baghdad was interested in those projects. While the second faction never outright argued that debt should be used as an excuse to take over Iraq politically, that was the obvious conclusion based on previous experience, particularly in Egypt. It was a fear openly shared by the Arab elite in Iraq, who assumed that British investment was basically just a prelude to invasion. What both groups of British diplomats shared with local observers was a focus on colonization and the other social engineering schemes they assumed would follow the barrage. Though the diplomats were not interested in the kind of scientific comprehensiveness advocated by Wilcox and other irrigation engineers, they saw the barrage as part of a socially comprehensive whole, so it was seen as unacceptable that irrigation and agricultural arrangements would continue as before. The assumption that social engineering had to go with hydraulic engineering was a way to dismiss the more immediate Ottoman political aims in constructing the dam, and also to envision a perpetual British expert and financial presence in the region. The Ottomans, though, were able to divert Jackson and the British by proposing other hydraulic projects which would continue employing British engineers without entering immediately into the question of social engineering. In practice, funding the barrage was a much messier process. Theoretically, the bank was supposed to advance money to Jackson to cover their expenses, and the Ottoman government was supposed to reimburse them on a rolling basis. In December 1912, the system hit a roadblock because of Ottoman budget shortfalls. Jackson threatened to cease construction if he was not reimbursed. The bank paid up, but demanded an almost immediate turnaround from the Ottomans, to which the central government agreed, but the Vali of Baghdad refused, and there followed about a month of negotiations over payments and then partial payments before the matter was resolved. The crisis had the effect of exposing how false the apparently united fronts, both on the British and Ottoman sides, were. On the British side, Jackson and the bank were constantly sniping over whose responsibility it was to provide funding, and using this kind of brinksmanship tactics, like threatening to stop work or stop capital flows, and in fact the National Bank threatened to shut down operations entirely during this period. On the Ottoman side, the crisis revealed a disjunct between central government and provincial priorities. Without having looked at the Ottoman records on this issue, it's difficult to pinpoint the cause of this divide, but I think it's clear that there was one, and it's potentially important in thinking about the dynamics of imperial modernization and centralization in this period. This particular funding crisis was also the event which prompted Lorimer's suggestion that the government of India try to loan the Ottomans the funds to finish construction. It appears that the Ottomans began reimbursing the bank quickly as soon as they learned of these British intentions, suggesting that the state shared many of the same anxieties as the local elite. Though the Ottomans were in fact more than complicit in bringing British capital to Iraq, the practical difficulties associated with funding projects like these highlighted the tensions inherent in this new Anglo-Ottoman friendship. Ottoman desires to attract British finance capital and modernize infrastructure were always moderated by wariness about British intentions. In closing, I'd like to just briefly draw out some of the dynamics created by the competition between these two forms of informal imperialism in Iraq, and to think about how their differences might point to shifts both in the relationship between economic and political power and in the Anglo-Ottoman relationship on the eve of World War I. Ottoman observers were not actually inclined to differentiate between different kinds of British interference in Iraq, and we see Ismail Haqqi, the Baghdad representative to the Ottoman parliament, in 1908 bemoaning the, quote, clause of English influence in general. But actually I think the dynamic created by the existence of different imperial projects limited the extent to which those clauses could really sink into Iraq. In September 1911, a controversy developed because Jackson had awarded the Lynch brothers a contract to transport construction material to the barrage site. The Vali of Baghdad insisted that they cancel the contract if the British wanted to maintain positive relations with the Ottoman Empire. And surprisingly, the British ambassador in Istanbul agreed. Both the ambassador and the Foreign Office took the opportunity to launch vicious attacks on the Lynch Company, attacking them personally, as well as accusing them of holding back the development of Iraq instead of supporting it like irrigation presumably would. They accepted at face value Wilcox's prediction that irrigation would render navigation on the Tigris and Euphrates impossible, taking that as an excuse to at least rhetorically abandon the Lynch brothers and trash navigation and trade as sources of political power. The grand possibilities suggested by the nascent irrigation project on the Euphrates forced the British to confront the failures of trade as a basis for imperial political power in Iraq, and also clarified the ways the Lynches had been able to exploit their political position to their own economic advantage, basically making the empire beholden to a single company. The rapid British abandonment of the Lynch brothers also points to shifts in the political role of economic interests. While the Lynches had always felt the need to assert and reassert their own position within the empire, despite the direct financial support of the postal subsidy, the Jackson Company was always more secure in its imperial positions. This seems to potentially indicate the greater political significance of investment, but also the ways in which a more anxious British Empire in this late phase felt it had to cling to these kind of informal imperial tools. I think the legitimacy claims also point to shifts in the Anglo-Ottoman relationship. However they subverted those structures, the Lynch brothers were claiming legitimacy through an Ottoman framework, the Farman. Jackson's work, on the other hand, relied on international open tenders, which in fact were never concluded, and they basically just operated solely on temporary contracts. This might indicate a weaker Ottoman position in the international arena, but I think it also points to changing frameworks of legitimacy within the Ottoman state. The competition between the two forms of informal empire in Iraq also provided opportunities for the Ottomans to advance their own interests. It's clear that while both Lynch and Jackson satisfied some Ottoman governing priorities, the empire was far more committed to the success of the irrigation project, and they were able to leverage the divided British position to put pressure on the Lynch brothers, advancing some of their own governing goals. Overall, I think the experience of Iraq is important in helping us understand how British economic imperialism was actually implemented and what imperialism even means when we're talking about this variety of different interests and goals. Looking at the issue as well within the context of the Ottoman Empire provides a context in which imperialism was mixed up with interstate relations. British imperialism wasn't something that could simply be imposed on a place like Iraq, where there was another imperial governing power with its own priorities. At the same time, this kind of relationship on the periphery helped clarify interstate relations. By 1913, most British capital in the Ottoman Empire was in Iraq, and British diplomats referred to Iraq as, quote, one of the most vital parts of our sphere of influence. Though I would hesitate to draw a direct line between these informal imperial projects and the 1914 invasion of Iraq, it seems reasonable to say that the history of British involvement in Iraq made it an obvious place for an invasion, and we can see the legacy of these projects continuing in British governments in Iraq after the invasion. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Okay, thanks very much, Camille. We're going to take questions after all three presenters have spoken. So I'd now like to invite Piro Recepi to talk. He has recently spent 3 years teaching in New York University. He's now begun a fellowship at the Max Planck Institute for Ethnic and Religious Diversity. He's also recently published an article in the Brill Journal of Southeastern Europe entitled From Orientalism to Homo-Nationalism, Queer Politics, Islamophobia, and the Europeanization of Kosovo. You can, Stacey, come up there.
So my presentation today is part theoretical reflection on thinking and rethinking the history of Muslims in the Balkans and those in Central and Southeast Asia in the early 20th century, and part historical reading of the events that accompanied Albania's partition from the Ottoman Empire at the onset of World War I, looking at how this event resonated with Muslim subjects of the British Empire and gave rise to a formation of the pan-Islamist movement. In other words, I want to look at the story of World War I, or I want to take the story of World War I, rather, to the peripheries of both empires, the Ottoman and the British Empire, in as much as we can think of India as the periphery of the British Empire and the Balkans that of the Ottoman Empire. The relationship of these peripheries is generally footnoted in the larger context of great power politics and major historical junctures, such as World War I, World War II, and so forth. However, today I want to look at the relations between these peripheries outside the dominant powers, where political formations that emerge at the beginning of the 20th century, while still very much tied to the centers of power, in this case Istanbul and London, they nonetheless organize their own political projects and imagine futurities that aren't always compatible with the geopolitical strategies of the centers. I look at how European interventions and excursions into Ottoman territories were politicized by Muslims in Central and South Asia, giving rise to a pan-Islamist movement that precedes the pan-Islamist movement of World War I. I say precedes because we are usually told that pan-Islamism was an Ottoman project, a last effort by Mehmed V, pressured by CUP government, to appeal to all Muslims to trample the Caliph's enemies of the Ottoman Empire, as the Ottoman Empire joins the Central Powers in the Great War. Recent work has also tried to point out that pan-Islamism may have been more of a German project than an Ottoman one. After all, the Intelligence Bureau for the East, set up by Germany in 1914, operated in extensive networks of agents and money which connected pan-Islamist activists across the world from Kashgar to Marrakesh. Yet the assumption that pan-Islamism was an Ottoman or a German or a joint project not only stands on account that pan-Islamism emerged with World War I as a political tactic, but also based on the dominant Eurocentric considerations of history, still burdened by Orientalist assumptions. The operating logic at play here is that there was no possibility that people in the villages and towns of Albania or India could even connect with each other prior to World War I, let alone articulate a pan-Islamist movement. Moreover, the impossibility of a grassroots political pan-Islamist movement that transgressed the geopolitical borders of the time is also based on what in queer theory, particularly Elizabeth Friedman calls heterohistory, or the understanding that there's always has to be the bigger person behind the subaltern formation, for the subaltern can never really talk on its own. Moreover, post-World I national histories have frequently ignored supranational movements in favoring singular nationalist movement towards the establishment of the nation-state. The role of the Paris Peace Conference in this regard cannot be understated. Like Turkey, Albania sought to sanitize its national independence from any pan-Islamic impulses and struggles, seeking to orient its nationalist project towards a narrowly defined Eurocentric modernizing futures, which saw pan-Islamic resistance as a fanatical movement at best. Nationalist narratives and political projects sought to synchronize Muslims in the Balkans with the historical timeline of Europe, limiting the reading of Muslim histories in the Balkans to European memory and mythology. Revisiting pan-Islamist peripheral movements, then, is not only important to understand the plurality of anti-colonial resistance from India to Albania, but also in exploring the vastness of possibility imagined by Islamist activists to remake the Ummah after the Ummah. So I start with one such movement, the Muslim uprising in Albania between 1912 and 1915, against the British-Ottoman agreed independence of Albania at the Conference of London between 1912 and 1913. So, in the first part, I want to examine the Muslim uprising in Albania. In the second part, I will examine how Muslim struggle in Albania resonated with Muslims in British India and the subsequent form of pan-Islamic solidarities that emerged thereafter. So, from a broader perspective, my research seeks to unmap Islam in Eastern Europe by questioning the dominant organization of time and historicity. How to investigate, then, the history of Muslims in the Balkans without following any given temporal scheme of consequential sequences organized as conventional history would dictate around the great wars of the 20th century. How to think of the history of Muslims focusing around a series of failed revolutions against European colonial and secular encroachments. How to provincialize Europe in area studies across the academia that continue to read the history of Muslims in the Balkans and in India in the registry of Europe, Eastern Europe, socialist, post-socialist, etc. that not only make them strangers to the post-colonial geographies and histories, but also employ in larger geopolitical bordering strategies. Rethinking these events through the perspectives and proponents on the fringes of these histories not only directs attention to the histories that the nation-state wishes us to forget, but allows us to consider how things have been and could be otherwise. So in 1913, in November of 1912, Albania declares independence. A group of Albanian landowners and nationalists with Austro-Hungarian backing had declared independence from the Ottoman Empire. Yet the Albanian independence, unlike the independence of Greece, Serbia, and Bulgaria, could not rely on its Christian Europeanness to celebrate its partition from Turkey and return to its rightful mother. To accommodate an overwhelming Muslim majority population loyal to the Caliph, the nationalists framed their project around existential questions of staying in Europe and becoming European, or performing hijrah and moving eastward together with the leaving Ottoman empires. There is, quote, "there is no alternative," wrote Samish Frashli, quote, "Albania is part of the geography of Europe," end quote. As a result, the Declaration of Independence comes to be seen by a majority of Muslim Albanians as a threat to their way of life. The Muslim ulama at the time refuses the dichotomous and extreme ends of the argument, calling the work of the nationalist a fitna. One of the noted Muslim clerics of the time, Mustafa Ndroqi, would write that, quote, "if we are being claimed by Europe because we are part of the European geography, then how can Europe claim India so far away from its borders?" End quote. Yet, despite the internal resistance and in the chaos of the Balkan Wars, and to avoid further tensions between Austro-Hungarian, Italian, Greek, and Serbian claims to what was being left behind from the leaving Ottoman Empire, Britain recognized the independence of Albania and led the establishment of the International Control Commission, a European-wide mission, first of its kind, along with an international military and police force, very similar to the EU missions in Bosnia and Kosovo today, actually, to look after and govern Albania until such time as Albanians had been trained and Europeanized enough to be fit to govern themselves. The powers also agreed on a German prince, Wilhelm Zuid, to be the ruler of Albania. In February 1913, several months after the Declaration of Independence, Kadri Bey Pecini, a noted Muslim intellectual from Albania based in Istanbul, would write to Dervish Bey Pichaku, who was based in Durrës and was organizing a Muslim resistance, quote, "the Turks are worse than the Europeans. They don't mind to see us go. They would like to trade Rumeli for less than our own Bashibuzuks," end quote. He further urges the Dervish Pichaku to, quote, "please remind the ulema to talk of the faith of our brethren in Bosnia, Serbia, and in Greece, to remind them of what awaits the Muslims when they shun the shadow of the Caliph," end quote. In another letter in April of the same year, he writes again, quote, "the Pashas won't hear of helping, but I have met several Beks from India." Here he's talking about Ansari and Zulfikar Khan, who had arrived in Istanbul as part of an Indian mission sent from Muslims, the All-Muslim Indian League, to Istanbul to assist with the humanitarian disaster happening at the time. Want to set up villages with money from our brothers in India for Rumeli Muhajirs. I asked them if they could help, and they have replied positively," end quote. Muslims in British India had started to show interest and frequently sent aid to Muslims in the Balkans. The first record of interest on the Balkan subject among Muslims in British India are reports by British officers as early as 1897, when the Greek-Turkish War of Thessalia had aroused strong sentiments among the population of Lahore. One Woosnam Mills, for instance, reporting in the Civil and Military Gazette, writes that, quote, "as the Turks waged wars on Christians on the plain of Thessaly, the Muslims here too are inspired to exterminate the infidels from India," end quote. While details on the formation of larger movements, pan-Islamist movement, are scarce, and much more research needs to be done to understand this period, the Italian invasion of Tripoli in 1911 finds a pan-Islamist movement already formed. The political organization behind the movements are well documented in the political activities that Muslims under British rule undertook to pressure Britain to condemn the invasion. The Pakistani historian Abdul Rauf writes brilliantly and chronicles the public reading of newspapers and prayers in mosques throughout India on the situation in Tripoli. British official reports note how the decision to block the Ottomans in Egypt on their way to Tripoli was a political move that had angered Muslim subjects of the British Empire. The onset of the Balkan Wars that would follow in the following year would further the movement from political sentiments to solidarity. In the meantime, the ambitious European-wide project to, quote, as in the words of the British ambassador to Albania, to turn Muslimans into Europeans, through the International Control Commission, was designated not only to establish a state infrastructure, but to also make citizens out of soldiers, and through various other political processes such as building civil society. Yet the International Control Commission and Prizvit were failing to integrate the various minorities in Albania, particularly the Christian minorities of Albania, who in the meantime had their own projects with competing Albania going on. The Orthodox in the south had declared Autonomous Republic of Voryo-Epirus, and in the north the Catholic tribes were unhappy with being promised by Austro-Hungarian and Italian agents in the last 3 decades, ending up soldiers in someone else's army. To forge a national unity and deal with the cracks that were appearing everywhere, the International Control Commission engaged in humanitarian work and publicizing this humanitarian work to gain the sympathy of the people. So it is in this background that a popular Muslim uprising starts to take place in central Albania. The initial resistance to the International Control Commission was localized and isolated. In response to an appeal by the Muslim ulema to the Ottoman administration that had been forwarded to Ahmet İzzet Pasha, whom the pro-Ottoman Muslim ulema in Albania had offered to become the king of Albania in 1913, İzzet Pasha replied that, quote, "There is no hope for an insurrection yet. Albanians don't know each other from Kaza to Kaza, and the supporting of the uprising in Albania would mean confronting Britain," end quote. Having resigned hope of a direct Ottoman intervention, the movement gathered momentum around the passing of the Organic Statute, which was to become the provisional constitution of the new Albanian state. In June 1914, Sheikh Haji Chamili led the Muslim uprising, challenging the legitimacy of the Albanian state and its partition from the Ottoman Empire. The insurgents sent an official demand to the International Control Commission for the removal of the prince and the appointment of the Muslim prince, and that Albania be returned to the sovereignty of the Caliphate as an autonomous province, and that Arabic be restored as the rightful alphabet. Chamili, who is a Sheikh of the Melami Tariqa, also demanded the abrogation of land privileges that the Albanian aristocracy had required through the so-called Organic Statute. The statute transformed all Arazi Mirie, crown lands, which were Ottoman-owned public property, bestowed for use to loyal subjects, to Arazi Memluke, or private lands, or privately owned lands. As the benefactors of these reforms were the small group of land-owning Albanian nationalists who had declared independence and were supporting the International Control Commission, Sheikh Chamili demanded the abrogation of these rights and the subsequent redistribution of land to the peasants. In less than 2 months, the insurgents seized most of the territory of the Albanian state, and Durrës, which was then the capital, remained the only territory controlled by Prince Vid and his provisional Albanian government. The news of an uprising in Albania made waves throughout British India. Abul Kalam Azad would write of an uprising in the news Al Hilal in India and call for funds and volunteers to be sent to Albania. Kalam Azad himself would travel from Delhi to Thessaloniki to deliver the gathered funds and meet with the representatives of the insurgents. In 2 weeks, the insurgents had won every battle with the International Control Commission and the Provisional Albanian Government. Several Dutch soldiers serving in the International Gendarmerie were taken prisoners, and later Colonel Thompson, which was the head of the security forces of the International Control Commission, was assassinated by the insurgents. By August 1914, all of Albania was under the control of the Muslim insurgents. Less efforts were made to emphasize the mandate of the International Commission as a humanitarian mission, to no avail. However, by May 1915, as the Serbian state moves through Albania, escaping the Austro-Hungarian invasion in the north, they also end the short-lived Muslim insurrection in Albania that sought to return Albania under the authority of the Caliph. Despite its failure, this short-lived resistance to European intervention in the Ottoman Empire resonated deeply with Muslims in British India. In an article titled "A Pan-Islamic Movement in Albania," the Tribune in Lahore wrote that the rebels' demand for using Arabic alphabet and having a Muslim prince are justifiably, it's a justifiable movement. The All India Muslim League also protested the ill treatment of Muslims in the conflict and warned the British government against further interventions into Albania. Then 2,000 volunteers responded to an appeal to fight alongside the rebels in Albania. In Singapore, the newspaper Majlal al-Islam condemned the intervention of Western powers into what was considered the internal affairs of the Ottoman Empire. In addition, the Times of India wrote in an article in praise of the rebels that, quote, Muslims are apprehensive that they will be persecuted by the Christian government of Albania as they are being so in Montenegro and Serbia, where hundreds of families are being forced into exile because they are Albanian Mohammedans. It is not very clear what happens to the insurgents after the Serbian army executes the main leadership. As I was doing research in Istanbul and the archives in the National Archives in Tirana, I found out that many of the soldiers actually joined the foreign auxiliary contingents as volunteers to become part of the Ottoman Empire in World War II. The emergence of a pan-Islamist movement in the late 19th and early 20th century was an effort to respond to imperialism, not as isolated units devised by the very colonial violence that they were challenging. Activists articulated global visions of freedom and employed a range of strategies intent on shaping foreign policies and influencing world events. While a united Ummah may have been an improbable utopian fantasy, that Muslims in Singapore and India at the beginning of the 20th century were concerned with their fellow Muslims in the Balkans provides an early account of collective struggles and solidarities, not guided towards Europe, but devoted to again remaking the Ummah. However small, the early 20th century attempts to build a transnational awareness of Islamic belonging was key in early forms of resistance against both colonial and nationalist violence. In this context, the ideas and networks that would later be utilized by the Ottomans in World War I to call on Muslims under British rule to rise against the colonial administration were in no small part the product of early peripheral attempts to make their own histories. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Pyotr. Again, I'd like to remind people that there will be time for questions after our final speaker, so if you have one, note them down now so you don't forget in time. So, our third speaker on the panel is Ambassador Altay Cengizer. He's the Director General of Policy Planning at the Turkish Ministry of Foreign Affairs. But equally importantly, he's also a historian who graduated at LSE. In fact, we shared the same supervisor, David Stevenson, who's written widely on the First World War, and subsequently studied at Harvard. Most recently, he's had an article out in the collected book War and Collapse, which is edited by Feroz Ahmad and Yavuz Hakan. So please, Ambassador Altay Cengizer, I'd like to invite you to give your presentation.
Thanks. Thank you, Daniel. Ambassadors, and I had the honor to work with Ambassador Sandberg at our good old, I should say, Opandat. Even the name was different then, not the Turkish permanent representation, to the European Union, but it was then the Turkish permanent representation to the common market. When after you left, a year later, it turned itself to be the European Union, and we continued to work. And since then, you have a very special place, of course. First, Ambassador, just welcome. I have just not at the right time, I would say. First, a few words in my capacity as the Director General for Policy Planning. I was there only 4 days ago, met with my British counterpart Peter Hill, and we had very good talks, almost seeing eye to eye on the mid-Eurasian, I would say, problems: Ukraine, Crimea, Syria, Iraq, and elsewhere. And it was always delightful to meet Peter. He is a very intelligent, capable counterpart. And we are sorry that, and we very much hope that you will be staying in European Union. It's of course an internal matter, but for our own egotistical reasons, we prefer. Now, these are my words as today's Director General for Policy Planning, but I'm afraid I will not be that nice as a Committee of Union and Progress deputy way back in 19. IHAN calls me so, and I accept that I'm a Committee of Union and Progress, and I will explain why. In 1905, Britain had this Whig government in place, March 1905, and they themselves called liberal imperialist government. That was how Grey, Asquith, and others regarded themselves. At the time, imperialism had not yet gained that odium with them, but they were proud to be liberal imperialists. Curiously, Grey had never visited even France, never left UK. And there was a revolution in diplomatic history in the shape of the Russian-British Entente. In 1907, there was this agreement mainly on, not Central Asia, I think the bulk of the agreement was about Iran. Iran had been carved into spheres of influence. Again, nothing wrong with that because we are talking about early 20th century. But the northern Iran, along with Azerbaijan, was to be under the Russian sphere of influence, and the south, for obvious reasons, was under the British sphere of influence, and there was a neutral, so-called neutral zone where the Russians always wanted to grasp further. But that was the essence. But in history, it means the Young Turks came to the scene about 5 years late. Because once this Anglo-Russian Entente was in place, the Young Turks had no chance whatsoever but to drift towards what they had to wake up in 29 October 1914. From the moment the Anglo-Russian Entente started to work, Nicholson and others were unabashedly Russophiles, and they did everything in their power to make it work, because they cannot imagine a continental Europe where Germany was becoming the primary force, with all those tirpitz and naval races and that, and they needed, of course, Russians, seemingly inexhaustible soldiers to start with, and other resources. Of course, the French, as you would expect, leaded that, because there was this French Franco-Russian Entente since 1896, and then the Triple Entente came into shape. That left no maneuver, no large areas of maneuver for the Young Turks, which in fact came into power only in July 1913. Otherwise, they shared power, and more importantly, they were not in power when the Balkan Wars erupted. They were out of power since 12 May 1912 until, with the coup of 31st January, they came back, still shared with Mahmud Şevket Pasha, but after the assassination, they were fully in power, so they were not in power during the Balkan Wars. The better diplomatic jargon to describe the nature of the Ottoman-British relationship at that time, I would say it was active hostility. Active hostility because the British assumed that this was an antagonistic relationship. You regard and you describe an antagonistic relationship when your adversary, your supposed adversary's every gain is to be regarded your loss. And this is how the liberal imperialist government in Britain looked at the relationship, basically. One important example is how the British coordinated this policy with the French. The French, of course, other imperialist powers did not like this Young Turk think of nationalizing everything. The Régie de Tabac, the main income, the revenue for the Ottoman government, was being tried to nationalize. Of course, the French were against this, but the Young Turks, the perennial problem of Turkey, not nowadays maybe, but they had no money, even to give to their state functionaries and all that. So they went to France to demand money. This is called in Turkish terminology, 1909 istikrazı, 19 credits. The French rejected it. More importantly, when the Young Turk delegation left for London, they dispatched a telegram to London saying that the British should not also give any credits to these people. This is somewhat paradoxical because the Young Turks were very much fond of France and Britain. As your predecessors, in the Ottoman times, ambassador was used to be met at the Edirne Adrianople station as a show of respect by a delegation sent from Istanbul, from the protocol department. But Lowther didn't even care to wake up. He continued to sleep. So this was how he regarded. And unfortunately, Lowther was not a good ambassador. He totally failed, I would say, in grasping the importance of the era. He was not even totally, I would say he had some anti-Semitic leanings, and Fitzmaurice at the time had the Eminence grise, which epitomized, I would say, an Eminence grise. Was very much influential on Lowther's policies. When he left, it was late. When Mr. Louis Malle came, he was a very good ambassador, in contrast. He tried to understand what is really going on, where the sources of power is, and all that normal things that an ambassador would normally look into. He tried all that, but it was quite late when he arrived in October 1913. Now, if we look at the eruption of the First World War, there are a few series of crises, rather, which have all to do with Turkey. Firstly, the 1908 annexation crisis. Then, at the time, it is the last instance where we can talk of British-Turkish friendship until the 1930s. The British helped the Young Turks out through their relations with Russia. And that question was brought to a solution, very much as the lady would know, to the dislike of the Serbians, the annexation crisis of 1908. Then That is the second crisis in the Italian aggression in Libya in 1911. Of course, the Italians assumed that they will be going to a stroll on the other side, as the Romans they were. But of course, it was not the case. Enver and Mustafa Kemal Pasha, they both organized the Sunni tribes and also the Turkish army. They, so much so that the Italians had to bring the war to Beirut. And they bombed Beirut and then annexed also the Dodecanese, which brought the war, the Libyan war, to the center of Ottoman geography. That was a clear sign for Serbia, Romania, Bulgaria, and Greece, who left their internal struggles over who will own Macedonia to another date and ganged against Turkey, the Balkan Wars, and of course, at the end of the Balkan Wars, Serbia was aggrandized twice in terms of land and also in population. And as every clock is right at least 2 hours a day, every paranoia is right to a certain extent. It fed very much into the Habsburg paranoia of the Serbians, and then all that happening friendship, which we now know that Pasic knew about this and did not want to stop. All kinds of things came together, confluenced, and the First World War erupted. To claim that Turkey could have been a neutral in this war is tantamount to exclude the existence, to reject the then 100 years existence of the Eastern question. There was no way for the Turks to be neutral in this war. So when we talk about, if we really want to talk about the British-Turkish relation, it goes more than 400 years. The first 300 years, of course, Stratford Canning and all that, ranking historians claim that if Stratford Canning was in place of Lauder and Mallet, they would have did everything to take the Ottoman geography on to the side of Britain. But of course, Britain did not do anything about that. It's true that the Entente powers offered a guarantee to the Ottoman government territorial integrity, but it was a sham offer, because that offer was in the shape of the Entente. They offered as the Entente to guarantee the territorial integrity of the Ottoman Empire. At the same time, they were planning against each other for after the war. So the Ottomans had a very direct question, which went unanswered. The question was, what will happen after the Entente? So you should give this on a bilateral basis. This is the normal thing to do. As Britain, as Great Britain, say you guarantee France and Tsarist Russia. Of course, that was not possible because the internal balances of the Entente itself was being secured through promises from Turkish lands. All those Balkan countries proved themselves to be very strong armies, almost a fifth power. So Bulgaria was offered Adrianople, Greece offered something else. Even one of the reasons, not the main one of course, but one of the reasons for Gallipoli, opting for Gallipoli rather than Lloyd George's Thessaloniki option was that this will give a show to the Italians and it will help the Italians to decide their place in the war by near the Entente. So let me decide. I'm published in Turkish actually, which is insofar as numbers mean anything. This is 1,300 pages, 1,300 footnotes and 750 pages or so. This is being translated into English, but let me read only very few pages so there is time to questions for every other colleague of mine. I will just read, to sum up, just maybe 4 pages. Let me find it. And for this chapter, lastly, of course, it took you, after I have to say this, it took you 10 years to come to Ankara after Istanbul. But the French were here. But still you were given the better plot. The French are not very happy, I guess, with what they are having come first. But anyway, this is only as a historian. Otherwise, we, and I myself, do value very much our special relations with Britain. It is one of the saner links that we have. A sober vision grounded in concrete geopolitical reasoning and not any nationalist or proto-nationalist ideology of identity guided those conducting policy towards Russian Empire in the final years of the Ottoman Empire. But the victor's explanation inundated the whole area of research and scrutiny and caused highly important details to fall through the cracks into oblivion. The allegation of pro-German bias within the Young Turk leadership is rubbish thrown in the face of scholarship, unless it is considered against the background of the persistently anti-Ottoman policies of the Entente, especially Great Britain. Not that the French were better, they were a bit more cunning, and otherwise it's the same. Whatever that particular narrative claims, Great Britain and the Entente had more than a fair chance to avoid direct confrontation with the Ottoman Empire. Yet Great Britain allowed this chance to pass in front of its eyes and refused to offer the Ottomans the benefits of an alliance or the prerequisite conditions for a meaningful neutrality. Instead, Britain chose to risk facing the Turks over the land of the still huge geography of the Ottoman Empire. Great Britain and its Entente allies made no substantial attempts whatever to win over the Ottoman Empire. One reason for this was the dismal British assessment of Turkish capabilities, which went hand in hand with the many prejudices developed over time and calcified in the mindset of the governing elite, as well as the judgmental attitudes of the Whig establishment in the time-honored tradition of William Gladstone. Yet this was the general assessment in Europe, but it would be an oversimplification to describe the attitude of the Entente toward the Ottoman Empire during the crucial 3-month period before it was left no other choice but to become a belligerent power as merely dilettante. The Allies, again mainly Great Britain, went far beyond being superficial and careless. The Entente approach was also scheming and provocative, resting on the self-fulfilling prophecy that the Ottomans had already sided with Germany. The German warships Goeben and Breslau, which after a long pursuit in the Mediterranean by the blundering Royal Navy, were able to find refuge in the Bosphorus, are often cited as proof. The Entente vaingloriously insisted that these ships be handed over with their German crews. The Ottoman government could hardly respond favorably to this. It would have cost the Ottomans their only chance to have a great power ally, and it was also seen as unethical. The ships had already been added to the Ottoman Navy, a creative solution under the circumstances, which Talat had come up with. The Ottomanization of the Goeben, Yavuz Selim, and Breslau Middle should have limited the damage to Ottoman neutrality. After all, the situation was totally sui generis, yet the Allies showed no evidence of nuanced thinking. The Entente was opposed to the Ottoman Empire not because it had turned into a German ally, but because the grand balance among the existing and prospective Entente allies could only be achieved by offering and dividing Ottoman lands. This was precisely why the Entente had been able to pursue constructive diplomacy with other prospective allies, save Turkey. It felt that its hands were free to offer Ottoman territory, depicting the Ottoman leadership as irreconcilably pro-German served other purposes. In 1914, Eastern Poland was part of Tsarist Russia. No one in Russia would continue to fight for a 30-kilometer strip called Posen. Nothing but the Glavny Priz, the big prize of war in Gray's description, would make meaningful the great sacrifices that Russia had to incur, even at the risk of revolution at home. To the horror of the pro-German establishment of landowners and other aristocrats around the Tsar. Gray and the Foreign Office understood this quite well. They knew that Russia would not continue to fight for long in pursuit of imaginary and undefined war aims, and that only a more solid, galvanizing war aim could compel all the Russians to keep fighting. In any case, Sazanov's perseverance and skillful diplomacy left no way to escape or postpone the Straits issue. His threats to resign and let the events take their course unless an agreement was reached very much frightened his Entente interlocutors. The influence of the conservative camp that would have preferred to reach a unilateral agreement with Germany seemed to be rising. Therefore, to view the March 30th agreement among the Entente powers to promise Constantinople and the Straits, with all its hinterland to Russia, as well as the well-described punishment for the Ottoman Empire for having entered the First World War on Germany's side, would be a gross oversimplification. Whether or not the Ottoman Empire entered the war, Tsarist Russia would have moved at some stage by every means at its disposal, diplomatic and otherwise, toward gaining the Straits. World War I was exactly the type of major European upheaval thought to be the precondition for Russia to move towards the Straits. There was this big conference on the 21st of February 1914, at the time when the Lehman von Sanders crisis was being subsided. The decision was that it was, if there is a great European upheaval, only then Russia could start moving towards Constantinople and the Straits. And the ukase of that day, through that, the infrastructure in the Caucasus were started to be being built and strengthened, including the Black Sea Navy. So we are now at a hopefully post-nuclear era. But 100 years ago, it was not a post-nuclear era, and it was not even a nuclear, so the Navy was very important. In order to project a superpower status, all states needed, or first-rate states, needed a powerful Navy. Of course, the British Navy was the most powerful in the world. Even the combination of the second and third more powerful navies did not surpass. However, the British did not have an army worthy to send to the continent. That was the biggest dilemma, not only of the British, but also the French, who kept asking for British forces in the continent to fight the Germans. So, of course, the Entente, the shape of British and French, they needed Russian armies. And at that time there was a saying that Britain would continue to fight until the last Russian is dead. So that is how the Russians started to see their involvement in this war, risking, there was a revolution after all in 1905, so they knew they were risking revolution at home. And the only great prize was, of course, Istanbul, and of course the Straits. And the 30th March 1915 very much opened that to the scholars and to the public opinion. Gallipoli, in that sense, is more important even than Steam to Eye, because it is not, the October Revolution, of course, did not happen because of Gallipoli. But there was a very critical input, I would say 10 to 15%, around that range. It helped to bring in the October Revolution, because we now have the memoirs of Russian generals saying that we are giving ammunition by teaspoons to our army. So the supply link was not there, and the already deteriorating situation even further deteriorated. And remember that this is happening after Tannenberg defeat and all that. So paradoxically, by winning the war or winning Gallipoli, Turks brought in their own contribution to the end of their arch-rival Tsarist empire. And thanks for the Bolsheviks, nobody has doubt what the Entente was playing at the time. However, these are not known, because it is still the narrative of the vainqueur, it's still the narrative of the victors. And again, I have to stress in front of two ambassadors, or rather three ambassadors, because Sandberg is a very good friend of Britain. I'm saying this is a friend of Britain in 2016. But we are talking about 1914, 1915. I will not go into how Churchill decided, etc. But then it was a very antagonistic relationship. So much so that it threatened the Turkish Empire, and we were saved by the bell, if you prefer to look that way. But today, thanks for our own national struggle, we can find in UK a modern, dependable, and very well-worthy friend. So I just wanted to contrast these two eras. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ambassador Altay Cengizer. We can now take questions from the audience, which you can direct to any of our speakers. Please go ahead. If you could introduce yourself before asking your question.
Thank you, sir. My name is Bill Dale. I used to be at the School of Oriental and African Studies, after which I was at Savanti University.
Then wait for a microphone, sorry.
Sorry, my name is William Hale. I used to be at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London, and then in Savanti University and at Koch University. Two points to make. One to Dr. Reshev's speech. You mentioned that Pan-Islamism was a German project rather than an Ottoman one. I had an interesting conversation before he died with Werner Otto von Hentich, who was the leader of the German expedition, diplomatic expedition, to Kabul in 1915. And he was part of this Pan-Islamic project on the German side. And all I can say is I can simply confirm that I asked Werner Otto, what did the Turks say about this proposal? And the message I got was that the Young Turk government wasn't that keen on stirring up a revolution in India. They didn't want the Germans to divert resources away from the defense of the Ottoman Empire. That was their previous thing. And the point was that the German plan was to raise a rebellion of the Indian Muslims, as you know, which Werner Otto, by the way, accepted was just a chimera. I mean, it was not realistic at all. But the point was that would have been not much benefit to the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire was worried about being invaded by the Russians, rather than stirring up a revolution in India. The second point to Ambassador Cengizer, I accept all your points about how the Entente powers made mistakes which pushed the Ottoman Empire onto the German side during the First World War. I take all that. I would add an additional one, which was that, because the British thought that the Ottoman army could be defeated very easily, because it had been defeated very easily, they thought, in the Balkan Wars, then Turkey could get wiped out pretty easily. Therefore, it didn't matter too much, even if the Turks were on the other side. That was the kind of argument. But I would still argue that it would have been in the interests of the Ottoman Empire to maintain neutrality, even under the conditions which the Entente powers were creating for. That, after all, the British argument during the First World War was, why are we fighting this war against Germany? It was to protect the neutrality of Belgium. It would have hardly worked to have said that the reason you were fighting the First World War was to protect the neutrality of Belgium if at the same time you were invading another neutral country, which was the Ottoman Empire. So I'm not completely convinced by your argument. I accept the point of the mistakes made by the Entente powers, but I don't entirely accept the argument about neutrality.
Take that question.
I don't know that was a question. I agree that
I'm sorry, I can't hear. Could you?
can you hear me now? Maybe? Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
So, I agree that at the onset of World War I, pan-Islamism becomes utilized by the German government. But this is not to say that there were pre-existing networks of activists that had started collecting funds and engaging in various forms of political organizing, particularly after 1911. So from 1911 to 1914, there's a movement, a network, an infrastructure of pan-Islamist activists stretching from Singapore to Albania. What the Germans did, and the reason that they're remembered for being the jump-starters of pan-Islamism, is that they actually turned it into a geopolitical project to, of course, create upheaval in India. But my argument was rather that pan-Islamism, unlike mainstream history would suggest, starts before World War I, and it's not necessarily a direct result of German geopolitics, but rather genuine struggle by Muslim intellectuals, the Muslim ulama, to articulate an alternative to the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, to reinvent the Ummah, so to speak.
I can answer a bit of the first question as well. In fact, the Young Turks were very much circumspect not to antagonize Britain. After a month of the 1908 revolution, a delegation of young Egyptians arrived to Istanbul, who wanted to emulate what the Young Turks did. No Young Turk leaders allowed to see them. So it goes even before, not the sharing of German resources to protect the Ottoman Empire and not the Indian, etc. It has been a behavioral thing before. In a way, as the Entente powers were a big disappointment for the Young Turks themselves were a big disappointment for other Eastern nations, the young Egyptians and others who wanted to emulate them. Now, exactly when Turkey in Europe ended in Balkan Wars, the normal expectation was that Turkey in Asia is about to end. I'm not just trying to be snobbish here, but there is a technical word for this. Bündnisfähigkeit. It is one of the few German terminology names in diplomacy. It is the power to attract allies. After the Balkan Wars, Turkey's power to attract allies was diminished to nil, but it went true for the Germans as well. The Turco-German alliance treaty of 2nd August 1914 was very difficult to achieve, because the German establishment, in terms of the Auswärtige Amt, the land army, whatever, apart from the Kaiser's military cabinet, who was somewhat very much open to Habsburg influence, because of the aristocratic links, etc. The Germans were very much against an alliance with Turkey for the same reasons British would have. Wangenheim was very much against. On the early hours of 2nd August 1914, the Kaiser himself phoned to Wangenheim, and you know how he spoke, very much always nervous, and he related Wangenheim and asked the alliance to be signed. So it was a very difficult task, even the German alliance. The Belgian, that was a fig leaf, you know that. The real reason, of course, Britain had to answer this question. In the event of Entente victory, they will not be able to leave as they used to leave, having left them to their own devices. In the event of a German victory, it was even worse. So, of course, you know that it took 2 days for British to decide. And it came as a surprise to the Germans that indeed British took sides, and also to the Turks as well. The Turks were not expecting. The 2nd August Treaty talks of only one country, Russia. Talks about no one else. It is why Enver Pasha, after Britain entered into the war, called the Russian, Gears was already in Petrograd, but he called Leontiev, the German, the military attaché, Russian, and started another offer to side with the Entente, because he had seen now that Britain was in war. Of course, we have to due to the brilliant diplomat, Paul Cambon, who was the ambassador to the court of St. James's, the French ambassador. He saw that Britain was undecided, and he said that only 4 months ago we signed a treaty. Because of that treaty, there are no French ships in La Manche. It is given to your protection. And all our ships are in the Mediterranean now. This is a treaty. And there, Grey couldn't manage it. 2 ministers from the cabinet resigned, but it had nothing to do with Belgium's neutrality. It was, nowadays, this is a good cause and protect poor people, Flamings, Flemish, Rubens or Martin, all that is the same thing 100 years later. The real reasons were different. Britain could not imagine a world after another answer's victory. And I think they were right in that kind of thinking. Secondly, there was no guarantee. There was no guarantee at all. At the time, of course, we are talking about seasoned imperialist powers. At this time, I'm employing the word in not a pejorative sense at all. These are seasoned powers from the 1500s onwards. It is second nature to them to plan for the day after. The British were very worried about rising Russian influence in the war and after the war. So they had to plan it. So we are talking about an offer which is coming from a political construct which the members of which wouldn't be able to guess 2 years later. So there was no offer at all. If the Young Turks didn't go to war, they should have been court-martialed, because Gallipoli was under blockade, Basra was under blockade, otherwise there is no way to explain how British forces went in the course of 3 days from Basra to Baghdad. And Iskenderun and the Syrian coast was also under blockade. Blockade in and of itself is a cause for war. So a month before 29th of October 1914, there were instituted British blockades. You know what triggered Turks? The Russians. They were about to institutionalize their own blockade at the mouth of the Bosphorus in the Black Sea. Our national struggle was won through shipments from Inebolu and Kastamonu area in the absence of roads. The only way to supply the eastern frontier was to go through Hoppa. So So that is why if the third blockade was instituted, the Ottomans could have regarded themselves as finished off. So that was a decision inescapable in that sense.
Okay, we can take another question from here.
Also,
Thank you.
gentlemen.
Muzaffer Erökten, retired ambassador. Actually, as I understand, the Ottoman-Britain relations were swinging between enmity and enmity and vice versa. Now I start with the humor, and thereafter I ask a question. Most probably, my colleague Altay Cengizay may answer that question. But, actually, during the Gallipoli campaign, there were British soldiers from faraway lands, like Anzac. And also, I served in Melbourne, Australia, and then they speak English in a different manner. And their accent is entirely different. For example, two soldiers, Australian soldiers, they meet and they didn't know what they were doing and what they were going to face in Gallipoli. Two soldiers, they meet each other. One says, "I came here to die." The second one answers, "I came here yesterday." Because their accent is like this. When they for greeting each other, they say "good day," means good day. Actually, in the year 1912, the Ottoman minister in charge of the naval affairs, Mahmud Muhtar Pasha, ordered and paid for 2 or 3 ships, I'm not very correct about the number, to Britain. And I also made the payment. And the ships were not delivered.
That's even more interesting.
And then also very interesting, after 17 years after this event, in the year 1929, he was prosecuted and put on trial for making the payment for the ships without any guarantee. And then he was asked to pay back this amount. It was about 21,000 gold coin. I don't know today's actual amount, gold coin. But only for his reputation and good behavior, they made 5% discount. And eventually, this money is paid back. Thereafter, he was very upset and dejected. He left Istanbul and settled in Alexandria, Egypt. Because his wife was the daughter of Idil Ismail, the ruler of Egypt, and then the sister of King Fuad, and then also the aunt of King Faruk, the last king, King Faruk. And their daughter, Emine Fuad Tugay, married a Turkish diplomat, Hulusi Fuad Tugay, who was the son of famous Fuad Pasha, Mishur Fuad Pasha, the crazy. He was known like this because he was very brave. Only crazy people can be so brave. And then about this ship issue, it happened in 1912, much before this 1913, the Union and Progress power in Turkey. But Britain had a certain intention because for a long time in the history of English literature, and they treated Ottomans like the sick man of Europe. So this will be the eventuality.
If you are right, Ambassador, then there is a second case of sequestration, which I learned now. I think what happened...
Thank you very much. I will use my problem.
Let me answer to that right in order to give time to other people. The British, in fact, waited for the last installment to arrive at the bank. Cemal Pasha sent to Newcastle upon time to take delivery of these 2 ships. Yavuz Sultan Selim, not Yavuz Sultan Selim, Sultan Osman I and Sultan Reşat. Yavuz is good. Now, that was paid through public subscription after the Balkan War. So it had nothing to do with Ahmet Muhtar Pasha. I don't know what that is about.
Mahmud Muhtar Pasha.
Mahmut Muhtar Pasha, even 1912.
Mahmut Muhtar Pasha is the son of Ahmet Muhtar Pasha.
Yes, but it was paid through public subscription. The Ottoman ladies even sold their alliances, rings, etc. And Cemal Pasha sent a contingent of more than 500 sailors to Newcastle upon Tyne. And the British Marines sequestrated the ships just when the Tokatöreni, the flag-raising ceremony, was to be done. And they waited for the last installment to arrive at the bank. They phoned, they checked, and they sequestrated. It is even more complicated than that, because by doing so, they were not only taking a fully paid ship to British Navy, but they are doing something that was requested by their Russian ally. The Russians asked the British to sequestrate the ships and not to give. We have a very bright diplomat, Eric Crowell, who has been writing, who later became in the 1920s the permanent undersecretary. He was 10 years ago, still was very bright, but very much anti-Turkish and all that, insofar as those things mean. I mean very much a plethora, more than a plethora of stereotyping against Ottomans. He wanted those ships to be given to the Greeks. And curiously, he had a German father. So he was a very, I assume he was a very complicated character, but which added insult to injury was that Churchill wrote to Enver Pasha saying that he is prepared to pay back for the ships £5,000 a week. If you computed that, it would have taken 17 years and 2 months to prove that that was an affront, really. More curious, and these are all epiphenomena still. What is important here is that it shows on that sequestration took place on 28 July 1914, 4 days before the start of the war, and 6 days before the entry of Germany. So, of course, the atmosphere was already there. But it shows something, that Britain did not think an inch about the probable Turkish public opinion. Did not care. It did not care how the British public opinion would be affected by this sequestration, because there was no peace party involved that the British still to this day keep talking about. There was no British party. There were just people a bit more afraid and with a bit more decided about what's going on. So that's the real issue, I think. If you take a fully paid 2 dreadnoughts, and that was to protect against the Greek Navy, because they became very powerful, and they won the Thessaloniki, not Thessaloniki, Thessalia war, because of the supremacy of the Greek Navy. So it is a very complicated question. If there ever was a peace party within the Committee of Union and Progress, the British should have helped them to strengthen their hands. They did exactly the opposite, because they knew it was their creation, their propaganda. There was no peace party. Apart from Cavit Bey, even they had already lost Cemal Pasha, who visited France and understood at last that there was going to be no offer from the Entente. Those ships were HMS Agincourt and HMS Erin. Those were the original Ottoman ships. They served in the Second World War as well. And in Lausanne Treaty, there is a specific article on that. We agreed not to ask any compensation for those ships from the British.
But actually descendants of Mahmut Muhtar Pasha should ask for compensation, not the government.
They will need a very good law firm for that.
Okay, we can take another question. Yes, so,
This gentleman over there, he has been the first one.
which one? Okay.
He is-
Finally, I was able to get the mic, thanks. My question is for Piero
Could you
Regepi.
introduce yourself first?
Sure. My name is Metin Atmaca. I'm assistant professor of history at the Social Science University of Ankara. And my question is for Piero Regepi. You mentioned about the Pan-Islamisms, which kind of had grassroots movements among the intellectuals. But when I look into the Kurdish case during World War I, I see several phases of Pan-Islamism. There is a version of British Pan-Islamism among the South Kurdistan, among the Kurds of South Kurdistan, and the Sheikhs, which collaborated with the Russians, another kind of version of the Pan-Islamism, as well as the CUP's Pan-Islamism. So there are basically many phases of Pan-Islamism. So how do you connect them all together, or what is that divide them all together? Thanks.
I mean, that's a great question. I totally agree that there's many pan-Islamisms that emerge at this stage. And I'm not familiar with all of them. Like, for instance, I'm not familiar with pan-Islamism that emerges with the Kurdish population. I'm familiar with pan-Islamism in the Balkans and pan-Islamism in British India. And even here, there's no cohesive pan-Islamism. So for instance, in India, active pan-Islamists are divided between the League of Muslims and a various different group that forms in the northeastern frontier around Kemal Azad, who later would come to the Ottoman Empire several times on a mission. The pan-Islamism that emerges in the northeastern frontier, northwestern frontier, is a more grassroots pan-Islamism that's influenced largely by the ulama, and particularly by the kind of ideas that Jalaluddin al-Afghani would later make sort of mainstream in the pan-Islamist movement worldwide, or that had earlier influenced by his earliest views of pan-Islam. The Indian League, on the other hand, propagated a pan-Islamism that was not revolutionary in any sense, but the kind of policy pressure on the British government. So they acknowledged the authority of the British Empire, and they believed that the best way to preserve the interests of the Ottoman state and to preserve the Caliphate was to continuously pressure the British government to work politically in such a way that it would benefit the Ottoman Empire. In the Balkans, you have similar splits, also along ethnic lines, in the sense that there's pan-Islamists who completely reject the partition from the Ottoman Empire, even though the Ottoman Empire doesn't support them. They clearly get messages from Izzet Pasha every time they appeal to him for help that for the Ottoman Empire this is a done deal, that we have no interest in sending support to Muslim fanatics in Albania. There's pan-Islamists who also become part of the International Control Commission in the provisional government of Albania, thinking that by becoming part of the government they will influence the overthrow or the replacement of the German prince with a Muslim prince and the return of the Arabic alphabet and so forth. The more dominant group, of course, is the group that organizes the uprising and overthrows Prince Wilhelmspeed along with the International Control Commission, but to no real political end, since they actually become, I use the word loser with a grain of salt, of the whole affair of Albanian partition from the Ottoman Empire. So to make a very, I don't know that I can give you an answer to this question, but yes, there's multiple pan-Islamism, and I wanted to address that in the paper, but given the short period of time that I had to make broader assumptions under terms like, also Ummah is a very problematic term in the sense that what are the political futurities and projects that these pan-Islamists see as an alternative to the nation state? Pan-Islamists in Albania really believe that the Ottoman Empire would survive and would retake and regain strength in the Balkans and so forth. So there's also, their political projects are very diverse as well.
Yes, so, can we bring a microphone down here? We'll come to you afterwards. Here first, please.
Selçuk Esen, ben from Boğaziçi University Asian Studies Center. One comment on Pan-Islamism, because I've been working on it for the last 20 years, I guess, in terms of Pan-Islam in East Asia. But my conclusion is, and I can see the dichotomy here, which I think is really, very important. Pan-Islamism is an intellectual discourse. As you say, it's grassroots, the origins of which actually go to basically the Tatar population of Russia. And it's an anti-Russian discourse originally. Kind of an identity searching, we don't want to be Russified, we want to sort of keep our Islamic identity as Tatars, and yet, also be part of the modern, agendas and so on. So you can trace that in India, definitely late 19th century, as a global intellectual shared discourse. But there is, by the early years of the 20th century, out of all of this grassroots, if you will, fertile ground, a group of agitators and activists who volunteer their services to the great powers. In other words, the Germans don't just concoct up something because it's their imagined, trajectory. It's because people like, Abdurrashid Ibrahim and many others who have been spending practically all their lives against, sort of one empire, the Russian Empire, and next the British Empire, they end up in Berlin. And they offer their services. So one has to also realize there's this transnational activist group of people, not too many in number, Barakatullah from India, for example, who are usually in exile, who are without their own government or country that they desire, and they're willing to collaborate with a world power. Whether that's Germany today, and in my case, I know that they offered their services to the Japanese. But we'll talk about that tomorrow. Thank you.
I mean, just briefly, I can't say that I'm in full agreement with the idea that it's only an intellectual discourse, partly because in certain instances it does become a political project that does get implemented. Although it lasts very short, of course, because all political forces of the time are against it. So if you look at the case of what the Muslim rebels in Albania do, they form a government that they believe is a Muslim government. They remove the land titles that were taken over by the landed gentry or the aristocracy that benefited from the independence movement. They re-establish the Sharia courts. And they also allow for the representatives of European powers in Albania to stay as ambassadors. So this is an attempt to accommodate both the pressure of regional powers as well as European powers, while also articulating what they believe to be a just Islamic form of governance. So of course this is influenced by the intellectual discourse of the time, but also by the political conditions. I would say that the Albanian case is probably the more pragmatic pan-Islamist, the most pragmatic pan-Islamist implementation I've seen, in the sense that, well, not necessarily because, there's also after World War II and the third non-aligned movement, there's a lot of other interesting projects, but in the sense that they don't see the project stopping there. If you read the letters that they exchanged among each other, they really saw themselves in the same way that the Soviets saw themselves at the beginning of the revolution. They wanted to create the safe space under their control whereby other pan-Islamist activists would come in, get trained, create networks, create a center, a nucleus, wherefrom they could be sent to India, to Egypt, to other parts of the Muslim world to kind of recreate the revolution. So it's very short-lived. It's kind of the beginning of a Muslim international, if we're going to use the Marxist term of reproducing the revolution elsewhere. Of course, nothing happens out of that, but I just wanted to illustrate it as a case where it does become implemented for less than a year.
Question, gentleman here.
My name is. It's working. Nice it is. My name is Rhodes Murphy. I'm from the History Department at Peking University in Ankara, and I'd like to bring the discussion back to the age of imperial innocence. The first paper addressed innocence or a different sort of logic, and particularly about the Hindia Dam project. You point out rightly, of course, that the Lynch brothers were providing a service of sorts, navigation up and down a major waterway, but it wasn't very efficient and it wasn't very profitable, and it didn't necessarily serve either British imperial interests or really, if you think about it in terms of helping an ally or a friend, it wasn't particularly, I mean, the mail just didn't get delivered on time. In terms of the Hindia project, I don't know if you've studied the sort of proposals and the project proposals and so on, but technically, of course, it's not impossible to achieve, and had it sort of borne fruit, it would have opened up huge tracts of land to agriculture, in which the investors, the bank, and other partners would presumably stand to be not just beneficiaries, but profit considerably from that investment. So, of course, it's hard to say what might have happened had it come to full fruition. And of course, Wilcox went on to build the Aswan Dam in Egypt, and that was, of course, a very useful support to the idea of humanitarian or benign imperialism, that such things could be achieved. So I'm just wondering, in terms of the Hindia project, it's earlier, of course, whether or not that sort of thinking was in any way expressed or found kind of a philosophical basis in the planning of the project, and the reasons to continue it and to support it.
Thanks. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, well, so I think there's a couple of really interesting threads that you pulled out there. One of them is Wilcox himself, who actually starts really proposing the Hindia Barrage as early as 1903, and part of that is because of his biblical enthusiasm, and he's very much, his Christianity, he was an evangelical, very much informs his desire to regenerate southern Iraq, which he sees as the actual literal site of the Garden of Eden. And so that's a really big part of his personal ideology, and you actually see that reflected in some of the other British engineers from British India who are coming along after him. Another really kind of interesting thing is that the Hindia Barrage project is never really conceived as a standalone project by Wilcox. It's conceived as part of, I believe, a 15-phase project to basically revamp the entire hydraulic infrastructure of Iraq. And if you look at some of the early British plans for the Nile, it's kind of similar to that, in that it's seen, what they're interested in is something that is much more comprehensive than what happens. And there's a couple of reasons that it doesn't happen. One of them is that it was not financially feasible for the Ottoman government at the time, but also the Ottoman reasons initially for building the Hindia Barrage were basically that the Euphrates had switched its course, and so a whole lot of formerly very, very fertile land became essentially desert over the course of a very few years, which was devastating to the tax revenues. I think one of the estimates is that they lost 57,000 pounds a year in tax revenues from this area, but it also causes a lot of internal migration, which is disruptive to sort of urban administration. And so that they have much more sort of immediate political aims. But if you look at the way that British administration of hydraulic resources continues after the invasion and the occupation of Iraq, they're sort of constantly referring back to Wilcox's entire plan, not just the Hindia Barrage, which is protected very early on, but to sort of whenever new plans for irrigation are proposed, there's always this question of, well, can we fit this into Wilcox's plan? Does this fit, will this contribute to the irrigation of Iraq as a whole? Because especially prior to the focus on, the discovery of oil, or really the discovery of how big the oil reserves are in Iraq, there's still the idea that Iraq can be this breadbasket and can be part of a sort of agricultural, be an agricultural profit center for the British Empire. I mean, with regard to the question of investment and kind of returns to investment particularly, I'm not really sure. There are the bank itself, like in its correspondence, does point to the fact that is the end point. They're not actually making money off of the barrage. That's the kind of end point is later on. But of course, it doesn't actually get inaugurated until November 1913, and there's not really a whole lot of lead time for kind of the change. So you see sort of immediate agricultural impacts, but because in the immediate aftermath of the construction, basically irrigation and agriculture are continuing as they did before, just with the Euphrates split into two. There's actually a great deal of sort of British frustration over that, but it sort of gets superseded by the war.
Do you mind if I add something on that?
Yeah, do we have time for so many questions?
Yes, it's just before that, but Ambassador, Hugh Strachan is coming to Ankara on the 15th of April. We are organizing something which will be run in English. Hugh Strachan of the St. Antony's from Oxford. He is a very reputable historian, of the First World War. He will be coming here, along with Margaret Macmillan was here for our ambassadors conference. So you are invited to that at 1640 if you can do it. Michael Reynolds, Robert Garvard, and Alexander Krettel, who wrote the only available biography of Golsh Pasha von der Goltz, is also will be coming. It won't be that much anti-British. It's just. But this is only a price we have been paying for being for so long supreme power. This is not that much. And also the gentleman who asked the question, the British had their own imperialist projects, like the Tigris Valley Railway project. This was a cause of two ultimatums to the Ottoman government. They wanted a Tigris Valley Railway which should run parallel to the Baghdad Railway, and of course the Ottomans had no reason to want it. It will be seen, and they saw it rightly, as a definite partition into zones of influence. One zone of German influence, and then so there was this very imperialist project in Iraq as well. I just wanted to compliment it because you referred imperial innocence. Then yes, Lynch were innocent to a certain extent, but then we have this perfectly imperialist Tigris Valley offer, which caused two ultimatums to the Turkish government because they rejected it.
Okay, we're running out of time, so if we have the last question from David Logan.
So much. It's a question for Camille. It's probably a rather naive one. The period you're talking about comes long after the international postal agreements were made, which are generally regarded as one of the earliest examples of multilateral constraints on national sovereignty. This is required participants to agree among themselves on the terms on which this took place. The terms in which you've spoken about these two empires' attitude to posed as a policy is entirely nationalistic, imperialistic, if you like. It's rather as though DHL was doing the same thing for Germany these days. Did no one at the time think this was a bit strange?
Well, that's a great question, and I'm not sure I have an answer for it. As far as I know, at least in the beginning of this period, there were no Ottoman post offices in Iraq. So it's possible that this partially had to do with the fact that Iraq was very much on the periphery of the Ottoman Empire, and particularly, in the early period. This was just after the Ottomans had sort of reclaimed Iraq from Mongols, which happened in 1831. So you actually have the use, I mean, up until quite late, I believe until the 1870s, you have the use of Indian stamps in Iraq, and that is one of the first sort of diplomatic battles that happens, is to outlaw the use of Indian stamps on the British mail in Iraq. So I'm not really sure. I mean, my impression is that the sort of extension of post offices was part of the extension of sort of government services Ottoman government services overall into Iraq, and that the existence of the Indian Post and the resistance of the British to discontinuing the Indian Post was seen as a direct kind of threat to sovereignty. But that's not really an answer, so I'm sorry.
Okay, thanks for all the questions. We're going to take a 15-minute break, after which Richard Moore, the ambassador to Turkey of the UK, will give a short speech. So see you back here in 15 minutes. Okay, if everyone's seated, we can move along to the next part of our programme. I'm going to invite Ambassador Richard Moore up to give some regards. I mean, this is particularly important for us. Without the support of the British Embassy, we wouldn't have been able to hold this event, so we're incredibly grateful to the Ambassador and the rest of the team at the Embassy who have been very helpful over the last weeks and months, as well as providing the essential financial support without which we couldn't have brought everyone here today. So please, Ambassador, if you could make your remarks.
Well, I feel rather guilty because I think people were having a set of extremely good conversations and enjoying themselves. And now you've been dragged back in here with an antique bell that Özlem doesn't know where it came from, but it served the purpose very well. And it says down here, I have to say, minister, ambassadors, and I think professors, I can say doctors. But it says ladies and gentlemen, but I'm not sure there are any of those left, are there? There's probably a few normal people in here. But anyhow, ladies and gentlemen as well. It's lovely to be here, and I can assure you you're not going to get a speech or a lecture from me. I'm here to introduce the main act, and I will keep it that way, and I cannot, I assure you, match the erudition of my Turkish colleague. I listened to the Ambassador Cengiz there, thinking, my God, as a colleague, he knows an awful lot about the subject. And,
don't worry, nothing else.
I'm glad I don't have to negotiate with him over things that went on 100 years ago. I would lose, definitely. Anyhow, it's very nice to be here, and it's a fantastic thing to support. We're really proud to be here and to be supporting it. And thank you very much for inviting me to come along, and congratulations particularly to Uşak, who, under the leadership of Özlem Sanberk, are a fantastic partner for us and a real jewel in the crown of independent thought in Turkey. So it's a pleasure to be with you. And the British Institute, which of course is chaired by one of my very distinguished predecessors, so I have again the intimidating experience of speaking in front of somebody who has been through and done all of this before. Anyhow, it's lovely to have you here, David, and lovely to have you staying with us, with Maggie and myself. And the work that David oversees and that Lut and the team lead here in Ankara from the British Institute, again, is the jewel in the crown of what is nowadays, I guess, called soft power, isn't it? But it really is. It does tremendous work in terms of advancing scholarship in Turkey on subjects to do with Turkey and the surrounding area. It does it in an incredibly low-key, rather academic way, and is all the better for that. And for those of you who've never visited it, please go. Fantastic library, wonderful people, and I always enjoy. Lut often gives me the opportunity to meet the sort of new intake of postdocs, and they're an extraordinary bunch of young people who delight in studying the most obscure subjects about which I know nothing, but it's fantastic when somebody can tell you all about Byzantine toiletry habits as they investigate them. But anyhow, it's a fantastic institution. I commend it to you. Last year we had, again, Ambassador played a really key role in putting this on, and it was a tremendous success. We had the centenary anniversary of the Gallipoli landings, and you know, it's something to watch British and Turkish leaders, and of course leaders from around the world, most particularly Australia and New Zealand, for whom Gallipoli has a particular resonance. They're accompanied by, of course, members of our armed forces and by some relatives of some of the veterans, some of them only one generation away. Their fathers had served at Gallipoli, some grandparents. And I had the great privilege of acting back in 1990 on my first posting to Turkey as an escort officer to the Royal British Legion. And we brought out, if I remember rightly, 5 British veterans, plus a Canadian was in that party, and of course there were many times that many Kiwis and Aussies, and of course many Turkish Ghazis. And I think the youngest, if I remember, was 93, the oldest was 108, I think, 109. And of course it was the last time at which the veterans were able to come out and join in that commemoration, the 75th, very special. And you know, I think it gave me a very striking sense of how a desperately fought campaign of great violence, great concentrated violence over many months could be transformed over the intervening years into a really strong bond of friendship between the Allies on one side, the Entente powers, the UK and France, of course, at the heart of that, but the UK then, the British Empire, and as I mentioned earlier on, you know, for Australia and New Zealand, and of course for Turkey, something which many people in the UK, I don't think, fully understand. They know about the Anzacs, and they know about the role of Gallipoli as a founding myth, if you like, of those two countries, the sense of where their sense of nationhood emerged from. Many fewer people in the UK understand just how central the legend of Çanakkale plays in, if you like, the founding myths that surround the birth of the Republic of Turkey. So it was a very privileged, I feel doubly privileged to have been there as a young man back in 1990, and then to come back by some fluke as ambassador in 2015 was very special. So I think this is a very short opportunity to reflect a bit on the relationship and the huge change in relationship between our two countries. And I am a firm believer, although I can't match Ambassador Cengizer's erudition, I am a firm believer that you can't understand the present if you don't understand the past. But I am rather acutely aware that I'm talking to an audience of eminent historians, and I'm not going to venture my own theories of history in this company. I am a PPE graduate from Professor Rogan's University, a subject choice which I can tell you any Oxford historian will tell you gives you the pretensions of a polymath, but no real intellectual depth. Perfect training for diplomacy. So instead, I thought I would focus my remarks on the way the past affects present relations between Turkey and the UK, and how, if you like, the UK sees the tomorrow of that relationship. Because the fact is, and I from time to time become acutely aware of this, the period that you're discussing today, and over the next day or so, it may be 100 years in the past, but it still very much shapes the way that the UK is seen in Turkey. So words or phrases like Lawrence of Arabia, Sykes-Picot, the Treaty of Sèvres, 6-year British occupation of Istanbul, those 2 warships mentioned earlier, paid for but never delivered, those are still reference points today. And even for young people in Turkey, this is not something that dies with the generations. It is kept alive, and it's certainly kept alive. It's part of the educational curriculum in Turkey, and each generation is retaught about the perfidy of the Brits in the early 20th century. So, some of you I know follow my Twitter feed, UKAmbRichard, at UKAmbRichard, for those of you who'd like to start. You can see this demonstrated on a regular basis. If I say something that people don't like in Turkey, I suddenly become the Sinsi Adam, Sinsi English, sneaky, I become a Lawrence. All of these things come pouring out. And of course, at one level, it's comic, and I try not to engage too much in banter around it, but it's very strong, and I do feel sometimes that I'm like the kind of ambassador for the British Empire, and that I'm not actually the ambassador for the UK in 2016. So what you're talking about still resonates, and you can't, of course, you have to understand historical facts and historical memory. We shouldn't deny difficult aspects of our past, including British colonialism and the darker sides of that. But we should also understand, surely, that as you are considering today, it does not have to rigidly define our present or our future. My grandfather, my mother's father, fought against the British as a member of the Irish Republican Army, the IRA, and earned a medal from Eamon de Valera for his services against the British. And I'm very proud of that. My grandfather, I'm very proud of the work he did to secure Irish independence. But his grandson stands before you as a British ambassador. So enemies can indeed become allies. So as a result of those processes and events you're discussing, the UK and Turkey today are major strategic partners, as the ambassador was pointing out. And we each have an interest in the other's success. We're NATO allies, we're fellow members of the G20, and we work closely together in many other international organisations. The UK is Turkey's strongest backer in the EU, and we're deepening our bilateral cooperation all the time. I now lead, people may be interested in this, I now lead the UK's largest diplomatic team in Europe. So I have more people work for me than work for my equivalents in Brussels, Paris or Berlin. And that reflects the importance of what we're doing. We find ourselves in a time of multiple crises. Cooperation on counter-terrorism, on people trafficking, and on regional security is absolutely vital to both of our interests. And that requires people here building relationships with Turkish colleagues. But it's also a relationship that goes beyond these current crises. It's going to always be hugely important. I came here first in 1990. Turkey was incredibly important to me. I know that David was ambassador here at the turn of the century, having served here in 65, and this country has always attracted a great deal of interest from London, and we've always needed to make sure that we looked after the relationship. But if you look also at the differences, I was in Gaziantep again during this week, and Gaziantep and Kayseri are the two cities I often quote as examples of the differences that I've seen economically in Turkey over the 25 years I've been working on the subject of Turkey, and those are it. I mean, Gaziantep was a dusty southeastern town in 1990, and you look at it now, even with the stresses and strains that it's under and bearing so extraordinarily generously over the Syrian refugee crisis, it's an amazing place. It has modern modernity, fantastic hotels, fantastic shopping, wonderful restaurants, and I think one of the finest museums in the world. The Zugma Mosaic Museum is wonderful. So, Turkey's got a rapidly developing economy, it's got an enviable rate of economic growth and the capacity to do even better if structural reforms are implemented as promised. And it has more young people by some distance than any other country in the EU. So all of these things point to even greater significance in the future. So that's how we see UK-Turkey relationship today and in the future, but I strayed from what I'm supposed to be talking about, which is history. And so I'm going to get us back on track. I'd like to introduce Professor Eugene Rogin, Professor of Modern Middle East History at Oxford and Director of St Anthony's College, Middle East Centre. Professor Rogan is, as we all know, one of the preeminent scholars of modern Middle Eastern history in the UK, and has published authoritative works on late Ottoman history and the history of the Arab peoples. And I have to say, I've got several of my team here. I'm rather hoping that they have all read Eugene's book. He's perfectly, if you'd like to test them a little later, I can produce them for you. But I think, I read The Fall of the Ottomans, the Great War in the Middle East, 1914 to 1920, about a year or so back, and I thought it was fantastic. I don't think I've ever seen anything which pulls together the Ottoman point of view, the Turkish point of view, so clearly, and it makes it so real in the eyewitness accounts that you were able to give of the Turkish campaigns in the east of what is now Turkey, or down in Kut and indeed in Gallipoli. So it's a fantastic book, and if you haven't read it, I'm sure pretty much everybody in this room has, but if you haven't, then you must, I think, to understand this period of history. But there I go, this is the PPEist pontificating on history. So I'm going to stop, and it's with great pleasure that I hand the floor to Professor Rogan to present his keynote lecture, Soldiers on the Ottoman Front, the View from Both Sides of the Trenches.
Your Excellencies, my friends and colleagues. First, I'd like to thank Ambassador Moore for a fulsome and generous introduction. I'm proud to acknowledge my affiliation with Oxford, though I won't claim ownership. And I must immediately say astaghfirullah to any implication that PPE is not among the most glorious of degrees offered by the University of Oxford. I have been married over 20 years to a politics tutor. My marriage would not have survived if I said anything else. It's a great honor and pleasure to be with you today, and I would like to express my thanks to the British Institute for extending the invitation, and my great pleasure at being at the International Strategic Research Organization today. My first time to visit this very famous institution, but again, it heightens a sense of occasion, and so, Ambassador, for making this possible, my deepest thanks. And my talk today does stem very much from what I worked into my recent study of the Ottoman experience of the First World War. And I came to the subject in many ways rather like the Ambassador, through family connections, not to Ain Valera, but to the Ottoman front. And as some of you will know from the book, I opened the book by explaining about the death of my great uncle in the Gallipoli front in 1915. And I don't want to recreate that for you now, but it was just why, in visiting his grave in 2005, there was a kind of spark that lies behind the genesis of this book. Because I had grown up with certain stories about what the Scottish had endured in Gallipoli. And it's very similar to the kind of story that's told about Australians and New Zealanders. It was a moment in which the Scots saw themselves as being put forward sacrificially. The Scots as cannon fodder to protect English soldiers, actually, they were British. And where the Scots were sent out of their trenches into murderous machine gun fire by well-entrenched Turkish soldiers. And what is a fact is that the 8 Scottish Rifles, within 5 minutes of going over the top, suffered over 60% casualties. My great uncle, one of them. So when I went with my mother and my son, 3 generations, to pay our respects to my great uncle, I made a wrong turn on my way to the Lancashire Landing Cemetery and came across the Nur Yamut Memorial. And there I found there was a monument dedicated to the Turkish war dead of the exact same battle on the 28th of June 1915, the Battle of Zienderi, in which my great uncle had died. And it was only then that I learned the Nur Yamut monument claims 10,000 Turkish soldiers died. The number is actually more like 13,000. In other words, my family story was a total distortion. 3,800 Scots died. 13,000 Ottomans died. It was clear evidence that we in the West had absolutely no sense of what the war experience had been like from the Ottoman side of the trenches. And it came home doubly hard to me because I had passed myself off as an Ottoman and modern Middle Eastern historian. If I didn't know that, how could I expect the broader British audience to know it either? And in many ways, it was that which had inspired me to try and capture the experience of the Ottoman front as it was perceived on both sides of the trenches. And that's what I'd like to talk about in my lecture today. After a century of research, I think we have a fairly comprehensive sense of what the First World War in the Middle East looked like from the British side of the story. And there is a huge literature on all of this. If you look at the private papers held in London's Imperial War Museum or in the Australian War Memorial in Canberra, I also consulted Wellington's Alexandra Turnbull Library in New Zealand, and here you find just a voluminous literature of diaries and letters from individual soldiers capturing the experience not of the top officers, but of the Tommies, the grunts, the actual soldiers of the trenches. There isn't an analogous private papers collection in Turkey or the Arab world to match that. But what's been coming out in Turkey over the past 10 or 15 years that has been such a valuable resource to me and to you has been the wealth of diaries and memoirs published. And here I would salute the İş Bankası, Kültür Yayınları, which has brought out literally dozens of these books, and that have begun to provide for us the sense of what the experience of the Ottoman front was like in all of its areas, from the Caucasus to Kut, to the Sinai, to Palestine, and of course around Gallipoli itself, and is allowing us for the first time to begin to balance our history of the Allied experience in the trenches with the Turkish experience. And again, this is what I'd like to focus on today. As you read the Ottoman diaries against the Western equivalents, the thing that's unsurprising, perhaps, is just how much the soldiers had in common in the experience of trench warfare. When you read Turkish accounts against British or French accounts, the similarities by far outweigh the differences. They had the same experiences of the horror of the industrial scale warfare that they encountered in the trenches. This was something new, and it was as shocking and as horrible for soldiers on both sides of the trenches. They had the same focus as common soldiers on their mates, their friends, on the very daily business of survival, on issues of sleep, food, drink. The senses were a very important part of what the soldiers experienced, and they wrote about it, whether they were on the Turkish or the Western side. But the thing that struck me most is that, unlike the Western Front, what really comes through when you read both Turkish and European diaries of the Ottoman Front was the grudging respect, the sort of subtle admiration, the lack of enmity between Ottoman and Entente soldiers. It's very different from the way in which the British or the Anzacs or the French signed up to fight against the Germans. They called them the Boche, they called them the Hun, and they had a well-developed hatred that had been well-fed by a propaganda machine that gave young recruits every motive to sign up and go out and kill the Germans. They just didn't have the same antagonism towards the Turks or the Ottomans. There had been no machine to build that kind of antagonism. And when they found themselves at war with each other, it was almost by surprise on both sides. I don't think that the Britons or the Frenchmen or the Anzacs who found themselves fighting on the Ottoman front ever thought that they would be at war in Turkey. And I don't think that the Turks ever really imagined that they would be at war against Britain and France. They were more recently engaged against more certain nearer enemies in the Balkan Wars or against Italy. But the idea of taking on France and Britain would have been very far from the thinking of Turks right up until 1914. And so they found themselves at war without ever having had the time to hate each other. And it leads me even to question the title of the workshop overall, whether it's really from enemies to allies. I think the word I would use is adversaries, because they found themselves at war very much as a function of the alliances of which they were part, but not because they had the casus belli between themselves that drove them to hate and kill as genuine enemies. But in the evidence I provide for you in the remainder of the lecture, you can judge for yourself. I'd like to begin with what our accounts tell you about the way in which individuals approach the call to war. The Ottomans mobilized for war far more reluctantly than the British, the French, or their colonial soldiers. On the 1st of August, the Ministry of War sent off Enver Pasha's call to arms by telegraph across the empire. Provincial recruiting officers instructed the heads of all villages and town quarters to post notices on the doors of mosques or churches or town squares. These posters were printed on red paper. They were decorated with the Torah of Mehmed V. These posters all read, "Mobilization has been declared, Sefer Var, all eligible men to arms." All men, regardless of their religion, between the ages of 21 and 45, were given 5 days to report to the nearest recruiting office. Village headmen and heads of quarters followed their instructions, posted their notice, and were told to encourage martial enthusiasm, quote, by beating drums, showing joy and gladness, and not despair and neglect. Now, the fact is, there was no amount of beating of drums or showing of joy that was going to overcome the sense of dread that the average Arab or Turk greeted the news of general conscription. A Shiite Muslim cleric in the southern Lebanese village of Nabatea captured the public dismay in his diary on the 3rd of August 1914, writing, "The people were deeply troubled and agitated by the news of Sefer Berlik. They gathered in small groups in public spaces, astonished and bewildered, as if confronting the day of judgment. Some wanted to flee, but where could they go? Others wanted to escape, but there was no way out. Then we heard that war had broken out between Germany and Austria on one side and the Allies on the other side. This only increased the fear and alarm of the outbreak of a murderous war that would devour the cultivated land and the dry earth." It was fairly insightful. It was a war that was going to absolutely devour the cultivated lands and the dried earth. And I think that the southern Lebanese were within their rights to be deeply, deeply concerned. But Nabatea is just one little microcosm. The same reaction is reported by consuls right across the Ottoman Empire. Shops closed in Aleppo on the 3rd of August in response to mobilization orders. As one resident noted, great uneasiness prevails throughout the city. In the Black Sea port of Trabzon, the decree of general mobilization came like a thunderbolt, a consul reported. Though anyone evading conscription faced a death penalty, many young men preferred to take their chances and go into hiding rather than face what they believed to be more certain death fighting in the Ottoman army. In Istanbul, recruitment centers, flooded by men of military age, were in a state of total confusion. Harassed officials bellowed instructions to civilians who were herded like cattle, hungry, hopeless, and apathetic. It could take days for conscripts in Istanbul to get processed. And once assigned to their units, men were allowed to return home to collect their possessions and say goodbye to their families before departing for war. In each district of the city, a noisy band went house to house collecting the young men. The soldier would hand an Ottoman flag to the new recruit as he came out of his house, while others jumped and danced and shouted along with the band's music to drown out the women's laments. Irfan Orga, whose father went to war in this way, recalled, when they were leaving their homes, the band played a song of unbelievable sadness. "O warriors, yet again I must set out as a lonely stranger. My sighs and tears are too much for even the mountains and stones to bear. Ey gaziler, yol gorundar, yine garip serime, dağlar taşlar dayanamaz, benim ahu zarima." In this way, house by house, the Ottomans expanded their standing army from about 200,000 men, coming out of the attempts to rebuild the army from the 3 rather catastrophic wars preceding 1914, to nearly 500,000 men and officers before the outbreak of hostilities in November of 1914. Now, Allied and colonial troops enlisted for war with far more enthusiasm, but never suspecting that they would take their fight to the Ottoman Empire. When news of Germany's declaration of war on France reached Algeria on the 1st of August, 1914, patriotic Frenchmen flooded the streets of the city of Algiers in a mass display of patriotism. They sang patriotic songs like the Marseillaise or another French Revolutionary era war song called the Chant du Départ. And the Chant du Départ has the refrain, "The Republic is calling us. Let us vanquish or perish. For the Republic a Frenchman must live. For her a Frenchman must die." And the French in Algeria altered the last line in a way to implicate the Arab population of Algeria into this martial spirit. For her a Frenchman must die. For her an Arab must die. It sounded rather ominous. Sharing in a moment of enthusiasm, though, Messali Haj, who was a native of Tlemcen and would emerge as a later Arab Algerian nationalist, noted how, musically speaking, all these patriotic tunes stirred Arab Algerians profoundly. So it actually, even where you had a colonial situation as oppressive as French Algeria, could play on the kind of martial enthusiasm of colonized people. On the opposite side of the globe, from the theater of conflict, Australia and New Zealand responded to the call for war in Europe with no less a sense of duty to the empire than any Britain. It was their empire too, and they responded in kind. In Australia, the leader of the opposition Labour Party, Andrew Fisher, captured the spirit of the moment when he pledged his country's support, quote, "to the last man and the last shilling." The Commonwealth of Australia mobilised the Australian Imperial Force, and the Dominion of New Zealand called up the New Zealand Expeditionary Force in early August of 1914. The combined forces, of course, became the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, better known as the Anzacs. The men of the New Zealand Expeditionary Force came from all parts of the country and all kinds of backgrounds. They were farmers and mechanics, shepherds and bushmen, clerks and teachers, stockbrokers and bankers. They joined because their friends joined. For some, they saw it as a big adventure, getting away from their isolated homeland. Others volunteered out of patriotism towards Britain and towards the Empire. None had the slightest idea where they would end up fighting. But after 6 weeks of training, they were ready to go, very impatient to go. Trevor Holden, a young lawyer from Auckland, remembered how he and his fellows marched from the training camp on One Tree Hill down to the transport ships in the harbour. He wrote, "Auckland turned out en masse to see us go, and although most people were glad to get rid of the last hooligan element we were thought to include, we all thought we were heroes, and I think we bore ourselves as such. Personally, I took great pleasure and pride in the march, and the whole affair was certainly very dramatic and martial. When the bands played and flags flying, we passed from the world we knew through the great iron gates that shut off the Queen's Wharf, and so on to the ships which would carry us God knows where." Moving from the Dominions to the Raj, on the outbreak of war in 1914, Britain had two imperatives: to recruit as many Indian soldiers to the war effort as possible, and to preserve the loyalty of Indian Muslims against Ottoman and German jihad propaganda. To advance both aims, George V, the British King Emperor, issued a proclamation to the princes and people of India. This was on the 4th of August. He set out Britain's reasons for declaring war on Germany and called on India for support in the British imperial war effort. Much to the British government's relief, the Indian ruling elite responded to the King's appeal with effusive declarations of loyalty. The loyalty of the Indian Muslims to the King Emperor, the Aga Khan asserted, is proof against any attempt of German diplomacy in the Near East or elsewhere to create a bastard pan-Islamic sentiment in favor of the mailed fist made in Germany. It's a convoluted statement, but it basically said we're with the British and against the Germans. And his views were repeated in public statements by Muslim princes right across India, widely publicized in the British press in India. Loyalty confirmed, Britain turned next to mobilize Indian troops for the war. India responded to George V's call with more volunteers for the war effort than all other colonies and dominions combined. Between 1914 and the end of 1919, some 950,000 Indians signed up for military service, and another 450,000 served as non-combatants. So you had a total of 1.4 million Indians serve with the British in the First World War. Soldiers of the Indian Army fought in every front of the war, over 100,000 on the Western Front alone. But their greatest contribution to the British war effort came in the Middle East, where nearly 80% of Indian soldiers served. In Gallipoli, just under 10,000. In Aden in the Persian Gulf, 50,000. In Egypt, almost 120,000. But overwhelmingly in the Mesopotamia campaign, where nearly 590,000 men from India served. So, the enthusiastic response on the side of the Allies is quite in distinction to the war weariness of the Ottomans when called up. But if we move from recruitment to the front, after the failure of Ottoman campaigns in Sarıkamış and Sinai, the first real major Allied offensive was in Gallipoli, and it's here where we really begin to get quite a volume of comparative literature on the Ottoman and Allied experience. Now, the campaign in Gallipoli evolved very quickly from a war of motion to static warfare in trenches. The Allies had succeeded in landing some 50,000 troops after the dead and wounded were accounted for, but they failed to make any of the ambitious tasks that the war planners had set for them. The British were supposed to roll the Ottoman defenders back and secure the high ground around Ulçatepe, some 5 miles inland, from which point they would secure the high ground and dominate the Turkish positions on the Dardanelles. And the Anzac troops were not only to seize the ridges overlooking the beaches around Adıburnu, but to secure the high plateau across the peninsula to Medos on the Dardanelles, cutting off all Ottoman lines of communication and resupply. Obviously, if they had succeeded in these tasks, the Allies would have been in a position to silence all of the Turkish defensive batteries in the Dardanelles and open the strategic waterways to British and French shipping to take the capital, Istanbul. Instead, the British and their allies encountered stiff resistance from the Turkish defenders, who drew lines around Anzac Cove and Cape Helles and doggedly refused to let the invaders pass. Over the summer of 1915, British and French soldiers transformed the landscape of Gallipoli into a complex grid of trenches. In the French sector, soldiers marched towards the front down a broad communication trench, optimistically dubbed the Avenue de Constantinople. While those returning from the firing line came down a parallel trench, heading back home, it was called the Avenue de Paris. The English, too, gave whimsical names to their trenches. Regent Street ran south from the front line past Piccadilly Circus into Oxford Street. And a particularly complex intersection of trenches was christened Clapton Junction, which is, of course, the most intense railway intersection in the British rail system. Dozens of smaller trenches were named for the regiments whose men had fought and died there. Lancashire Street, Munster Terrace, Essex Knoll, Worcester Flat. The most ironic names were reserved for the very front line itself. Here you found Hyde Park Corner, Main Street, and the one I found bleakest of all, Hope Street. For if you found yourself on that stretch of trench, there was very little hope indeed. The ironic names did little to mask the violence of the trenches. Those who served at both the Western Front and at Gallipoli found the Turkish front by far the more relentless of the two. It's much worse here than in France, in the view of all of those who have seen the two fronts, French Corporal Jean Lemonnier wrote home in June 1915. Britons were the same view. In France, apart from the full-dress attacks, an infantryman may live many months without once firing his rifle or running the remotest risk of death by rifle bullet, A.P. Herbert claimed. But in those hill trenches of Gallipoli, the Turk and the Gentile fought with each other all day with rifle and bomb, and in the evening crept out and stabbed each other in the dark. There was no release from the strain of watching and listening and taking thought. Life in the trenches assaulted every one of a soldier's senses. Their sight, their sound, their smell, their taste, and their touch. Trench warfare undermined the physical and mental health of those not killed or wounded. What Herbert described as the British experience in the trenches of Gallipoli held equally true for the Turks. The squalor and horrors of trench warfare were shared equally by the invaders and the defenders. From the moment a soldier arrived in Gallipoli, he lived with the sound of artillery. It was the Allies, however, who were the most exposed. Ever since German submarines had driven away British battleships from the mouth of the Dardanelles, Ottoman gunners on the Asian shores had direct line of fire onto French positions. And the Turks held the high ground overlooking both Helles and Anzac Cove and kept up a steady stream of shrapnel and artillery fire. Since we were positioned on the top of Alçıtepe, we were able to fire artillery wherever we wanted, an Ottoman artillery officer claimed. We were able to make war in a way that suited us. In addition to the relentless dangers of artillery and snipers, the Allies and the Turks regularly dug mines under each other's lines to try and kill from below. French Corporal Jean Lemonnier was awakened around midnight, his ear to the hard ground in his dugout, by the distinct sound of digging in the ground beneath him. As he listened, he heard the regular blows of a pick. It had to be the Turks, he concluded, digging a sap to blow up our fort. He quickly found a safer place to sleep. The one thing I fear is to end my days blown sky high over the trenches. But he never rested easy in that section of the trenches, fearing the Turks might detonate a charge beneath him at any moment. On the Ottoman side, Lieutenant Mehmet Fassi was more afraid of being buried alive by an underground explosion than being blown sky high. The punctilious young officer noted in his daily log that the enemy had detonated a mine so powerful that he felt the ground heave under his feet, literally buckle like a wave under his feet. It occurred where I had heard sounds of digging a few days back, he recorded. 7 men are missing. Later that afternoon, one of the missing men managed to extricate himself from the kind of tomb, much to the relief of the Ottoman lieutenant. There is no worse death than that, Mehmet Fassi reflected. To face slow death while fully conscious. My God, spare everyone from such a fate. Now, the weeks spent in the trenches were periods of waiting that were punctuated by major attacks. And the Ottomans and the Allies alternated in taking the initiative, leaving soldiers on both sides of the trenches in a perpetual state of tension. For all soldiers, the experience of going over the top proved the ultimate baptism of fire, and a trauma that survivors would never forget. Life in the trenches would be very agreeable, French Corporal Lemonnier reflected ironically, were it not for the bayonet charges, which are terrible. The men are mowed down by the many machine guns and the excellent Turkish marksmen before they even hoist themselves over the parapet. And each attack littered the battlefield with hundreds and thousands of dead soldiers, unburied between enemy lines in the intense heat of summer. The decomposing bodies infused the Gallipoli Peninsula with an intense stench of death. The trenches are filthy, and in parts of the parapet, men are buried with their feet projecting over the parapet, dead for days. And on either side, the dead lie unburied in the sweltering heat. Bartle Bradshaw, a young officer with the Border Regiment, wrote in a letter home. We do our best to cover them with lime. The stench is awful, and when you realize that what you sleep, you get when you realize what sleep you get is in half yards between the dead, and that you eat what meals you get in the same space, and if you stop waving a piece of food about for a moment, ... And what Bradshaw didn't want to finish the sentence saying was that if you stop moving your food around, it was immediately swarmed by flies, the same flies that were feasting on the dead. Clouds of flies carried sickness to the living from the dead. Soldiers on both sides of the line suffered from the whole range of air and waterborne diseases. The absence of proper latrines left soldiers who feared to expose themselves to sniper fire to relieve themselves in the same trenches where they fought, ate, and slept. Dysentery reached epidemic proportions. Raymond Vey, a French artillery officer, noted with growing concern the spread of disease among his troops. The inoculations given French soldiers against cholera and typhoid were no protection against the fevers and gastric disorders. In recent days, he wrote, there has been so much illness that even the officers' ranks have been reduced to nothing, he wrote in his diary. Unlike the Western Front, which provided opportunities for soldiers to take leaves in towns and villages removed from the fighting, there was no relief from the violence in Gallipoli. Even when swimming in the sea, The invaders were exposed to random shelling that killed and maimed men who were just desperate for a break from the fighting. Nor could they take refuge in sleep. The continual shriek of artillery, the percussion of impact, and the relentless demands of the front left men no peace in which to sleep. Soldiers' journals frequently note how little they slept. "My men are tired," Jean Lemonnier wrote, "and I am too, though I'm holding up." He managed only 2 hours of sleep on that particular night, between 2:30 and 4:30 a.m. And it was the same on the Ottoman side. Mehmet Fassi notes in his diary, only managed 2 to 3 hours of sleep throughout the night and had awful nightmares. As the weeks wore on, the daily anxiety and sleeplessness took their toll, as a growing number of men succumbed to a nervous breakdown or shell shock. A sergeant with the British Field Ambulance Corps first witnessed a case of what he called nerves on June 14, just 7 weeks after the invasion. Henry Corbridge was horrified by what he called the mental cases, pathetic sights with vacant stare and glassy look, and partial paralysis, some are raving. One case, a giant of a man who'd lost his reason, not a scratch on him, needed 8 men to restrain him while he was evacuated onto a hospital ship. Over the course of the summer, Corbridge noted ever more cases of shell shock, and by mid-August, he was actually reporting 5 times more mental cases than wounded cases. Now, Ottoman soldiers too suffered from shell shock. Ibrahim Arakan, a volunteer for the Ottoman Gendarmerie, was astonished to find his battle-hardened commander sitting in a foxhole with the sheikhs. "Ibrahim, my son, where are you going?" the captain asked him. Now, Arakan knew something was wrong when the captain called him "my son," because he was a hardened old bastard who always swore at his soldiers. The captain was disoriented and asked Arakan to accompany him. He'd lost his reason and willpower, Arakan recalled. His hand was shaking so violently that he was unable to hold his rifle. So even the hardest men cracked under the relentless pressure of the bombardment at Gallipoli. And months of combat came to shape how the invaders and defenders came to see each other. Whereas, as I said before, the popular press had really driven home a hatred of the Germans even before troops got to the front. British, French, and Anzac soldiers really had no prior antagonism towards the Ottomans. And they gave the Turks rather sweet nicknames. The British referred to the Ottomans as Abdul, or Johnny Turk. The French spoke of Monsieur Turk. The Ottomans did not reciprocate. They will refer to the English or the French or the Dushman. But I never really saw anything except the occasional reference to Johnny as a prisoner of war. The trenches were at some point so close that the two sides could hear each other speak. Living at such close quarters, however, seemed to have a humanizing effect on trench warfare. And in periods of calm, they would throw a treat across the enemy trenches. A Turkish soldier remembered throwing cigarettes, raisins, hazelnuts, and almonds into the Anzac lines. The invaders reciprocated with cans of fruit and jam by way of thanks. For Aminchad, the remarkable thing was that nobody ever took the opportunity to mix dirt into the gift or to follow up a pot of jam with a hand grenade. Whatever got exchanged across lines was actually done with genuine goodwill. There wasn't seen to be any spite in it. Now, I don't mean to suggest by this any romanticized notion that this was less than total warfare. There were atrocities committed by both sides, but there were also acts of compassion. I think that's the point that we really have to remember in the total war of World War I. Sergeant Henry Corbridge of the Medical Corps recalled treating an Ottoman prisoner who had saved a British soldier's life. The Briton, a sergeant with the Essex Regiment, accompanied the wounded Turk to the dressing station to ensure his protector was well treated. The Turkish soldier had been shot in the arm and the leg while helping the British sergeant, who had been pinned down by crossfire between the lines. So basically, a Briton caught between the lines is carried to safety by a Turk who gets shot twice in just saving the man's life. Corbridge and his orderlies, quote, saw that the Turk didn't go short of any comforts which we could give him while we were in hospital. So, this notion of enmity seems to me to be somewhat undermined by the way in which the experience at the front, so shared by men on both sides, humanized them in spite of the dehumanizing consequences of war. Now, the stalemate in Gallipoli was only broken, really, when the British recognized that they could not continue the campaign and began to plan their evacuation. The final evacuation from Anzac and Suvla took place over 2 nights and was completed in the early hours of December 20, 1915. Though they'd anticipated as many as 25,000 casualties in the course of their evacuation, every last soldier was evacuated without a single fatality. This was the great victory that the British could claim at the end of the Gallipoli campaign. And when you read the official history, they literally do put forward the fact of this very successful evacuation as their greatest accomplishment. The final decision to abandon Hellas followed shortly after the successful evacuation of Anzac and Suvla. On December 24, orders were given to withdraw from the toe of the Gallipoli Peninsula. As dawn broke after both withdrawals, Turkish patrols were amazed to find that the enemy had fully evacuated their positions. The departing Anzacs had left some nasty surprises behind. Quote, devices, some worked by candles, some by tins of water rigged up to fire old and broken rifles hours after the last man had left the trenches. A machine gunner wrote, home to New Zealand. Bombs which exploded on a spring being released are in all parts of odd places. Altogether, the first party of Turks that came over were due to have a few casualties. And of course they did. Ibrahim Aga Khan's men set off a number of these booby traps and hidden bombs as they reclaimed the vacated beaches. We suffered many losses, he lamented. But the departing invaders also left behind enormous quantities of supplies that provided very welcome booty to the cold and hungry Mehmedchiks. Ibrahim Aga Khan walked through the abandoned British tents, marveling at the supplies the invaders had left behind. One tent, he wrote, was like a marketplace, full of tiles, zinc, plates, bicycles, motorcycles, forks, spoons, and so on. On shore, he saw food and clothing supplies piled as high as apartment buildings. There was enough supply to meet the demands of an army corps for an entire year. Haki Sunata and his men took over one of the abandoned hospital tents and feasted on British marmalade, cheese, oil, and milk. The men in Emin Shah's unit were in high spirits the morning after the British had left. One of the men, a born joker, slapped a British hat on a comrade and pretended to interrogate him. Johnny, he said, why did you stay behind? The Briton, getting into character, asked a comrade to serve as his translator. I fell asleep, he said, to general hilarity. What did you do when we began to fire on you with our heavy new artillery? The Turk asked. The Briton silently hid his face between his knees in response. And then he raised his head cryptically and said, had those guns gone on for another day or two, it wouldn't have been us who'd escaped from here. Who would it have been then? His Turkish interrogator pressed him. It would have been our souls. And all the soldiers thought that was the funniest thing they'd heard. They all collapsed laughing around it. You read this now and you go, I don't get the punchline. But you had to be there. You had to have been one of those who had fought and survived at Gallipoli and saw the enemy off your shores to realize why that was a funny moment. As they withdrew from their trenches, the Tommies and the Anzacs left notes for the Ottomans promising to meet them again. An Australian war poet of no great merit captured his countrymen's grudging respect for the Turks who had beaten them back. I will quote the verse to you because it does capture the grit of soldier poetry. I reckon the Turk respects us as we respect the Turk. Abdul's a good, clean fighter. We fought him and we know. And we've left him a letter behind to tell him we found him so. Not to say precisely goodbye, but au revoir. Somewhere or other we'll meet again before the end of the war. But I hope it'll be a wider place with a lot more room on the map. And the airmen over the fight that day, they'll see a bit of a scrap. Well, the Anzacs were good to their word. They did get the chance to meet again. And it's in Palestine where many of the veterans of both Gallipoli, both sides of the trenches of Gallipoli would meet again. But before breaking Ottoman lines in Palestine, the British were to suffer another major defeat 100 years ago, this month actually, and that was of course in Mesopotamia. So what I'd like to do, I won't have time to go into reflections on the Palestine campaign, but just to give you the sense of a very different trench experience, let me tell you a bit about what happened in Mesopotamia. So by the time the British forces had evacuated Gallipoli, the Indian Expeditionary Force had already been 1 month under siege in the Euphrates town of Kut el Amara. Here again, Ottomans and Britons fought at close quarters from entrenched positions. The Ottoman army had established several lines of defenses between Aylmer's relief column and Townshend's forces in Kut. 2 divisions had been sent to reinforce the garrison in Baghdad from the Ottoman side. By January 1916, the 6th Army enjoyed numerical superiority over British forces in the Tigris. By the British estimates, the Turks had around 27,000 soldiers in the field, where the combined forces of Aylmer's relief column and Townshend's besieged units did not exceed 23,000 men. And still they thought they could beat them. And the only reason why the British were so confident of success was because they continued fatally to underestimate their adversary. As the siege wore on, the belligerents occasionally relented in their hostility, as it happened in Gallipoli. After a particularly hard rainfall, frozen Tommies came out of their flooded trenches to warm up over a game of football, oblivious for once to the omnipresent threat of gunfire. Reverend Spooner, who was a British chaplain at Kut, claimed the Turkish snipers became so interested in the game that they stopped sniping and watched and left the Britons to play until they finished their game. Another of Spooner's anecdotes captured a rare exchange of trench humor. A Turkish soldier, hard at work at the trenches, occasionally waved his shovel towards the British lines as if to say, "Cheero, ye British." After watching the Turk make several such waves, a British soldier took up his rifle and put a bullet through the shovel. There was no work for some time, Spooner recounted, when slowly and in a very tired way, up came the spade again, with a bandage wrapped around its head. Over the month of February 1916, waves of reinforcements were shipped from France to Basra to join the British Mesopotamian Expeditionary Force. They arrived piecemeal, often separated from their artillery or their horses in the heat of their transport. The chaos of the docks turned Basra into a real bottleneck where units were held up for weeks while trying to sort out their guns and their horses and their ammunition before setting off to the front. This delayed things enormously in trying to relieve the besieged troops in Kut. Matters were made worse by inadequate river transport, which meant that most troops had to march the 200 miles. So in this way, Aylmer received the 2 divisions he'd been promised to reinforce his depleted ranks, but far too slowly and unevenly to achieve numerical superiority over Turkish forces. So Aylmer, in charge of the relief column, faced a very difficult decision. Ideally, he wanted to wait until all of his reinforcements had arrived before engaging the Ottomans. But he knew with each passing week that fresh Ottoman troops, redeployed from the Gallipoli campaign, were reinforcing the Ottoman 6th Army, while Townshend and his men under siege in Kut were growing weaker by the day by the food shortage. Aylmer's dilemma was to pick the optimal moment to strike, on the basis of incomplete information on the relative balance of powers. And he chose to resume the offensive in early March as the siege entered its 3rd month. Rather than pick up where he left off on the Tigris, Aylmer proposed a bold surprise attack overland towards the Shatt el-Hai Channel, which connects the Tigris and the Euphrates at Kut. His target was the high ground of the Dujela Redoubt, the Ottomans' last major defensive point before Kut. Now, to preserve the crucial element of surprise, Aylmer proposed to march his troops overnight to strike Dujela at dawn. With the vantage point secured, he hoped to open a safe passage for Townshend's forces to break out of the southern reaches of Kut across the Tigris to link up with the relief column. And had Aylmer's troops followed the plan, they might well have succeeded. For the Turkish lines at Dujela were all but abandoned on the night of March 7, when the Tigris Corps set off for battle. But the disoriented British columns, crossing uneven and unfamiliar terrain in the dark, were delayed in their night march. They got lost. At sunrise on the 8th of March, the attackers were still 4,000 yards from the Dujela Redoubt. The British commanders assumed that the Ottomans would have seen their columns arriving across the flat ground in the early dawn light. So Aylmer believed that his forces had lost the element of surprise, and he knew from bitter experience that trying to rush lines across flat ground would lead to very high British casualties. So he ordered his officers to hold their troops back and to subject the Ottoman positions to an intense artillery bombardment to try and silence the Turkish guns before setting his men to attack the Turkish lines. The British gunners opened fire at 7 a.m. and kept up their bombardment for 3 full hours. But instead of protecting his men from enemy fire, the barrage alerted Ottoman commanders of an imminent attack at a point where they hadn't expected one. And they flooded Dujaila with troops. By the time the British were ordered into battle, the empty trenches at Dujaila had been filled. Ali Ihsan Bey was the commander of Ottoman forces to the south of Kut. He'd arrived from the Caucasus in February of 1915 and had spent his first month in Mesopotamia drilling his soldiers to fight in this new alien environment. He'd gone to bed on the 7th of March with no reports of unusual activity by the enemy. He was first advised of the British presence when the artillery barrage commenced, first thing that morning. As soon as he realized the gravity of the situation, Ali Ihsan conferred with the commanders of his mountain artillery and machine gun companies. He showed them the location of the British on the map. I told them to answer the enemy artillery and to fire on enemy troops as they marched. He then gave orders to the commander of the Ottoman 35th Division, a unit made of conscripts from Iraq, troops whose order and discipline he doubted. He had far more confidence in his Anatolian soldiers than he did in his Arab troops. So he told them, quote, "I would execute anyone who attempted to run away, and knowing of my reputation from the Caucasus front, everyone believed me." He placed his trusted Anatolian soldiers in the very center of the redoubt, confident that they would hold the line. Ali Ihsan Bey threw every unit under his command into Dujaila, while the British artillery kept up their barrage. So rather than running away from British artillery, the Ottomans ran right into it. The enemy did not send their infantry forward while the artillery was firing on us, the Ottoman commander noted. We benefited from this mistake, and all of our troops managed to arrive at the redoubt, to be in position before the British launched their infantry assault. He went on to express his full gratitude to the British for giving him 3 hours to get his men in position. Abedin Ege, a Gallipoli veteran, whose unit had been redeployed to Mesopotamia, was in the Ottoman front line when the British infantry began their charge. He watched as thousands of English and Indian soldiers crossed the plain, wondering how he could stop so many attackers with only 1 battalion. The distance between us and the enemy was only 800 meters, he wrote. Both sides started firing and the battle began. The enemy made every effort to reach us, but their forces were melting under the heat of our fire. Turkish casualties were mounting as well, as Ege reported mortars falling all around him. But they succeeded in holding their lines until reinforcements arrived in the afternoon. By evening, the British could no longer sustain the attack and withdrew. We had an absolute victory against the enemy, Ege boasted, but we lost half our battalion. Now, the assault on Dujaila, of course, is known in Turkish historiography as the Battle of Sabi's Hill. This is a very crucial victory for the Ottomans. British casualties in that one engagement were 3 times higher than the Ottomans suffered. And the magnitude of the Ottoman victory proved a great boost to Turkish morale and left the British despairing of ever relieving Townshend and his troops besieged in Kut. Nowhere was that despair more acutely felt than inside Kut itself. After hearing our heavy guns firing almost unceasingly for 3 days and 3 nights, and to hear them getting closer and closer, the forces here all ready to sally forth, the bridge ready for the sortie, Reverend Spooner wrote. It was cruel to know our relieving force had failed again. The Ottoman commander Halil Bey tried to capitalize on the collapse in the besieged troops' morale. On the 10th of March, Halil sent a messenger to General Townshend, inviting him to surrender. Townshend declined Halil's offer, but it made him think. And in his report to London, the British commander asked permission to enter negotiation with the Turks if there was any doubt of his position being relieved by the 17th of April, when his food supplies would be nearly exhausted. Now, as it turns out, they were able to stretch their food supply right up until the end of April, but under conditions that left both the British, who were reduced on their flour supply but eating all of their workhorses, and Indian troops, who only began to eat flesh when given specific dispensation by Hindu and Muslim authorities. Until then, they simply wasted away. But by the end of the month of April, there was just not nearly enough food. The British tried everything. The most innovative was to try and airdrop food into the besieged troops in Kut. The effort was condemned to failure because of bad weather, but also because airplanes at the time had so little power that the amount of payload they could carry was quite limited. And lastly, the pilots were actually very bad aims. Airplanes arriving all day dropping supplies, Spooner noted in his diary on the 16th of April. Seaplanes too, but these latter are bad droppers, and as often as not their parcels go into the Tigris or into the Turkish trenches. Abedin Ege, watching from the Turkish lines, noted that each airplane carried 3 sacks of provisions, and that aircraft had made drops from morning to evening on April 16th. 2 sacks of flour were dropped into our trenches, he remarked, confirming Spooner's observations about bad droppers. The planes managed 14 drops that day, but the total of 2,500 pounds of food provided less than 5 ounces per head for the 13,000 soldiers and 6,000 civilians sharing the food in Kut. Airdrops alone would not be sufficient to save the besieged in Kut. And on the 29th of April, they finally conceded unconditional surrender to Ottoman forces. The starved and emaciated British forces in Kut assembled at midday on April 29th to face their captors. So ended the long period of fighting, waiting and hoping, suspense and anxiety and starving, Major Alex Anderson wrote home. The impossible and unthinkable has happened, and one felt stunned. But there was some sense of relief mixed with the shock. After 145 days under siege, under relentless gunfire, after starvation, the British and Indian soldiers were glad to be at the end of their ordeal. They imagined, in many cases wrongly, conditions as prisoners of war could be no worse than what they'd already endured. The depression on the British side was marked by the elation in Turkish lines. Everyone is smiling with joy and happiness, Abedin Ege, the Gallipoli veteran, recorded in his diary on the 29th of April. Today was declared the Kut Bayram and will henceforth be a national holiday. He marveled at the scale of the Ottoman victory, taking 5 generals, 400 officers, and nearly 13,000 men prisoner. The English had never faced such a defeat anywhere, Ege boasted, and he was absolutely correct. At 13,309 men in total, Kut was the worst surrender the British Army had ever suffered. By midday on April 29th, the British and Indian soldiers were impatient for the arrival of the Ottoman troops. At around 1 p.m., a great cry went up, "Here they come!" And everyone scrambled for a view. Gunner Lee, watching from a gun emplacement, saw columns of them approaching via the ravaged fortress of Kut. Dark masses of troops that appeared to be running. They were some distance from us yet. I was amazed at their eagerness to get to us, Lee wrote. It was only the sharp commands of their officers that prevented them from running into Kut in disorder. And Turkish soldiers were quick to fraternize with the men with whom they had fought for so long. They handed out cigarettes to Tommies too weak to smoke them. Gunner Lee used every scrap of language at his disposal, French, Turkish, Arabic, with a little of the Cockney language thrown in, he wrote, to try and communicate with his captors. He found that many of the Ottomans he met were veterans of Gallipoli in search of Australians. Perhaps in response to those letters that the Anzacs had left behind in their trenches before evacuating. The Turkish soldiers, he wrote, seemed anxious to renew their acquaintance with our colonials with their idea of starting another little war. The officers too got into long conversations with their Turkish counterparts. T.R. Wells, an officer with the Royal Flying Corps, engaged 2 Turkish officers in conversation from 7:30 p.m. until midnight, telling many interesting details of recent events. Well, let me conclude. While engaged in relentless total warfare, the Allies and the Turks, I would argue, were more adversaries than enemies. The British, the French, and Imperial troops never demonstrated the same hostility for the Turks that had motivated them to fight the Boche or the Hun with such vehemence. You just never encountered the same degree of animosity or antagonism on either side of the trenches. Allied troops seemed surprised to find themselves fighting in the Ottoman Empire, as the Ottomans were surprised to be at war with some of the greatest European armies, and until quite recently, cordial allies, actually. We've had a lot of conversation about perfidious Albion in the lead up to the First World War, but it's worth remembering that it was a British naval mission that had been in charge of rebuilding the Ottoman Navy. France had been a great economic boost to the Ottoman Empire with its $100 million loan in the spring of 1914, which was a real injection for the investment in infrastructure that the Ottoman Empire was keen to do in the aftermath of the Balkan Wars. So these were countries that it was much more natural for the Ottomans to be at peace with than at war with. And I don't think that they ever had anticipated taking on the British and the French. Even more surprised, the Ottomans were amazed to have held and defeated those same powers in Gallipoli and in Kut, as they would go on to do twice more in the battle over Gaza. More than that, the common experience in the trenches, I would argue, humanized adversaries. Tommies and Mehmetchiks sought to fraternize in any lull of the fighting. There's a real sense that, but for the orders given by their officers, the men had no will to go on fighting an adversary they had no grounds to hate. But I think to appreciate this fact, you really do have to see the Ottoman front from both sides of the trenches. Thank you.
I'll just, you can now ask your questions for Professor Rogan. We're going to have a reception later, so bear that in mind and keep your questions and comments brief and concise, more importantly. I might take the privilege of asking a question now, seeing as I've got hold of the microphone. I've also worked on British soldiers' papers, although mainly in terms of their relations with Turkish civilians and their military counterparts, more in the period of the occupation of Istanbul after the war. And I have to say that I've actually encountered quite a lot of enmity there. But this question came to my mind. I mean, especially also when you turn to the political circles, there is this immense hostility towards Turks, a kind of what's labelled Turkophobia. Is the reason that we don't find this in Gallipoli letters or Kut letters a question of class? Is it that these Phil-Hellenistic circles don't penetrate the kind of lower ranks of the British army? And that, I mean, this is very important for British images of the Turk at the time. Or is there some other explanation for these discrepancies?
I'll come take the mic.
Yeah. And you can field the rest of the questions.
And I'll field your questions, absolutely. We're among friends here. I think the distinction you note, Daniel, is quite likely to be the difference between soldiers engaged in combat on a front and the universal loathing of an army of occupation. And the situation after the armistice and the British presence that was to follow was one not of men fighting in the field against each other, but of a victorious power occupying and setting the terms, and very harsh terms, on a defeated power. And I think one of the things that perhaps shapes a lot of the narratives of the trenches and helps to shape the memory of that war today is the fact that in each of the conflicts that I've talked about today, it was the Ottomans who came out victorious. And there is a generosity that comes with victory that, of course, would not be present in the conditions after the armistice. And I don't know the degree to which officers might have differed from their men. If one were to look at the officers who were engaged in fighting, someone like Townshend, who surrenders at Kut, very controversially fraternizes with his captors. And he would have represented somebody whose birth and upbringing would have made him more of a Phil-Helene than the Philo-Turk. But here again, I think perhaps it might have been a sympathy bred of his experiences at the front, and then the kindness that he was shown, or the dignity he was shown in captivity. But you know, I think it would have been quite different. The memory of Gallipoli, the experience of Gallipoli, had the Ottomans lost on that front or it could. I'm going to sweep this way. We'll work our way there. And what I'll do is I'll ask for a few of you to give me questions, and then I'll answer them so that we get. So, if, the lady in white.
Oh, yes. Two short questions, really. I've always
Hold on a
been.
second, there's a microphone coming. And if you could introduce yourself as well, that'd be great.
Jill Sindel here with the British Institute, really. Two small questions. First of all, I've always been intrigued by photographs and film of the Anzacs and the Turks fighting in Gallipoli. The fact that the Anzacs are wearing soft hats and the Turks are wearing helmets. That's one thing. Secondly, and I wonder if you can explain that, if it's a military thing or whether it's an economic factor. Secondly, I was very intrigued by your mention of the fact that many men were evacuated as being mentally ill. I'd always understood that certainly in the French field that this mental illness was regarded as a form of shirking, and that mental illness was not anything that really existed. It was a form of shirking.
Thank you. If we could have the next question.
Okay. It is always a great pleasure listening to you. I have a short question also. The Ottoman divisions almost on all fronts of World War I were assisted by a significant number of German officers and servicemen, and also by a much smaller number of Austro-Hungarian officers and COs and servicemen as well, not necessarily Austrian or Hungarian, also Poles and Czechs. And actually they are very much neglected in our official historiography in Turkey. How were these people, I mean German and or Austro-Hungarian soldiers, officers and COs fighting with the Turks, with the Ottoman Turks, perceived by the British Imperial servicemen, troops or officers in their diaries or journals, or how were they remembered later in that after World War I era?
Thank you.
Thank you. Actually, I am going to relieve you from question. Short comment. I start with the ambassador. He mentioned about the 1990 commemorative event. Actually, the star of that event was, if my memory is not betraying me, the Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. And then I very well remember that time from Australia, Australia was represented by Buck Hoff, Prime Minister, and of course the highest level was Sir Paul Reeves, the Governor General of New Zealand. And actually in Anzac, I mean in Australia and New Zealand, this issue is very much discussed, whether of course they developed their national identity due to developments in Gallipoli, but thereafter whether to be under the Queen still or be Republican. But in those countries there is RSL, Retired and Retired Services League. There is a very, very strong lobby group. They want to stay under the British Queen. Why? Because all their sacrifices during the wars would be meaningless if they separate totally from Britain. So they stay. And also, this is a very big demand for the Retired and Retired Services League. I mean, the mates, every week they meet in one of the clubs. There are plenty of clubs, the RSL clubs. I was invited when I was serving in Melbourne as a member of many clubs. I used to meet my colleagues and then talk to them over a beer, or a glass of beer. And also at a certain night in the evening, at about 6, 7, depends on the time, when it is dark, they put off all the lights and they all repeat the following lines. Age shall not, they shall not grow old as we are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun and in the morning, we shall remember them, and then drink all together. Because their image is still in their 20s. But these people I used to meet in their 50s, 60s, but they are always young. They maintain their image. Thank you very much for your expose. Excellent.
Thank you very much. I'll take those first questions, then I'll come to the satisfaction.
Yes.
In terms of soft hats versus helmets, my understanding is the enderia, which was what Ottoman soldiers wore, is actually very soft. I don't think there was anything hard to it. It's a sort of, it's a cap that's kind of half turban, half cap.
Yeah.
But I think everybody was in soft gear on that particular front. In terms of mental cases, you know, I don't think that there was any, I never saw one accusation of shirking in any of the records relating to the treatment of those who had nerves. And they call them nerves or mental cases, and they just recognize that this was a phenomenon. And, you know, they write with some compassion about what this did to perfectly able-bodied men. The one that stood up was this giant of a guy who took, it takes 8 to ship off the peninsula to get medical treatment. You know, there was no sense that these guys were shirking. But it was certainly a case in the Western Front, as we know. And many were, you know, sent back to face either the firing squad or the front as their options. In terms of what the diaries tell us about the German and Austrian participants, first of all, very limited Austrian participation in the Ottoman front. The only place I came across any numbers were Austrian artillerymen in the Palestine campaign. I didn't come across them anywhere else. They may well have been, but I just didn't come across any records of that. The only references I found in my sources to the Germans as active combatants on the Ottoman front was in the Air Force, or the assumption that the war planning was being done and directed by the Germans. These are the two places that you get references. And in a sense, it was all under the slightly patronizing view that this was the Johnny Turk being misled by the Bush. And it was the way they cast the Declaration of Jihad. It's the way they cast the Ottoman decision to go into the war, the whole, reflagging of the Breslau and the Goeben and all. This all adds to a kind of discourse about the way in which Germany is playing on the gullibility or the weakness of Johnny Turk. But I didn't actually at any point see encounters between British servicemen in the trenches and Germans. The only Germans I saw who weren't officers, the records, would have been technicians. So people who were bringing wireless communications, or in artillery, mobile artillery, they played a big role. We got Kinnigesen's memoirs on the Gallipoli front is a good example of that. But I think it's fair enough that their role is not played up highly by the Turkish historiography. The tendency to try and lay the credit for Ottoman successes on German officers is wrong. They were outnumbered in every sense of the word by Ottoman officers. And so I think if there's a corrective that needed to be done, it was to try and to balance the limits to which the Germans, they were hugely important allies. They provided the material, they were very committed to the war effort. Someone like Eamon von Zonders played a huge role. But, so too did Ottoman commanders. So, and the only thing I'd like to add to your comment about what made the sacrifice meaningful or meaningless, very interesting what you say about the Dominions and the Commonwealth. In a funny way, the opposite is true in the Arab world. And when you go through North Africa, there are no memorials to Moroccans or Tunisians or Algerians who fought in World War I, because in a nationalist age, the sacrifice they made for the French Empire wasn't valued. And in a sense, in the Arab world, there is also distance on the First World War, because in a post-Ottoman age, Arab nationalism frowned on recognizing the connection between the Arabs and the Ottoman Empire. And they did not celebrate the valor of Arab men who fought in the First World War or give them their due. I think it should be done. I think it remains to be done. But it's a very interesting point about what makes the sacrifice valued. If we could come to the center section now. Your Excellency.
Well, thank you. I'm very grateful, sincerely, for a wonderful expose. You have been referring to more than a few French memoirs, so I wonder why the French keep underplaying their role in Gallipoli, because they lost also nearly 40,000 men.
Their numbers were also just that much. I mean, they were 80,000 men total.
Okay.
So numerically, they were a very small contingent.
I see. And secondly, Lawrence was in Kut. In which capacity he was there? He was I think, negotiating the peace terms, probably. Lastly, what was the... I keep hearing different numbers of the Irish regiments. There were Red Monites and then others. Can you give a bit more precise numbers with regard to the Irish? And in fact, the Austrians were in Gallipoli as tradesmen. They were selling some goods. Thank you.
Thank you. Regarding the absence of memorials in the Arab countries, I saw in Bamako a memorial of Mort pour la France, and I think there are 6 angles in the memorial. One was for the people who has fallen martyr in Gallipoli. And most of them had Muslim names. So Bamakans, people from Mali, Muslims, fought against their own Caliph. This is one thing. So it is just to show you the difference between Arab countries and Mali. The other thing that I would like to ask, you mentioned in the casualties in Gallipoli, tens of thousands, I think 38,000 on one occasion, 13,000 on another, but the global, the entire casualties went up to 230,000, I think, on what? 500,000 soldiers were killed or casualties were noticed. So the reason why you mentioned only tens of thousands, how does it match with the 230,000 casualties?
I see it's 7 o'clock, and I don't want to go too late.
Okay, if there are a couple more questions, I think we
Are
can
there?
take those. Well, we have 4 more. Okay, make them as brief as possible, and we can take them.
So just a quick observation. I was, as you have gathered, I have Irish heritage, and I was very struck. Last year was fantastic because, of course, the Irish president came to Gallipoli, and what you described about Arab countries, of course, was so true of Ireland. And Ireland is only now beginning to respect the memory of those Irishmen who died in the First and Second World War. And it's part of this wonderful change of atmosphere between the UK and Ireland in recent years. So I just note that. I think there were 10,000 Irishmen who died. It's more than the number of Australians. It's quite astonishing for an equally small country.
Thank you. If we could, we'll just keep going close.
First of all, thank you for this excellent talk. Great as usual. You mentioned the effect of the Arab revolts later in independent Arab states. I recently realized one thing. Famous film of David Lee, Lawrence of Arabia. They tried to show it in the 60s in Turkey. It was banned. It didn't pass the censorship. It was shown only once, 1989, in Istanbul Film Festival, the special screening, and it was only possible to see the DVD. Then I learned recently, not in Jordan, not in Syria, not in Lebanon, not in Iraq, this film was shown. It was only shown in Egypt because Omar Sharif was an Egyptian. Okay, this is quite interesting. How nation states formed after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire perceive their so-called independence movement and a film about it.
Yeah, very tight. Thank you. There's one more in the front, and we'll come back. We'll get everybody. I'll be brief here, please.
Sure. Thanks for a great talk. I just have a quick question about the characterizations of the different soldiers on the Muslim front, how they regarded each other. So the Turks regarding Circassians or Balkan volunteers or recent Muhajirs. If you noticed anything interesting or stood out to you, I'd be really interested to hear.
Please.
Just to contribute your argument, a passage from the memoirs of Muhammed Lütfü Bey, who became Mehmet Lütfü Bey after accepting Turkish citizenship, following Alexandretta's entry into Turkey. He fought at Gallipoli front and noted this. During Eid al-Adha in 1915, British and Ottoman soldiers ceased firing and members of the Ottoman 57th Division communicated with the British soldiers who spoke Turkish. The British wished the Ottomans a happy Eid, and the Ottomans thanked to the British for their kindness. Soldiers from both sides talked to each other from a distance. The Ottoman soldiers presented cigarettes to the British while the latter offered marmalade. The commanding officers on each side, however, put an end to this, and the commander of the 57th Division and the other low-ranking officers under his command were punished.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. It so captures it. Are there any more questions from? Excellent. I will be as brief as you have been. T. Lawrence in Kut. T. Lawrence was sent on a fool's mission that reflected a very Orientalist outlook by the British top brass. They thought that there were two solutions to the desperate situation in Kut. One was to play on Turkish venality by bribing Halil Pasha. And he was authorized to give £1 million. It went up to 2. Initially it was 1, but it went up to 2. And, of course, Halil Pasha wasn't looking to pocket a couple of million, nor was Enver Pasha. He didn't want to take British money and let British, he wanted the victory. More than anything else, they wanted the cannons. The great irritation at Kut was about the spiking of the cannons instead of surrendering them. T.E. Lawrence was sent with that mission. And the other was to try and play on tribal antagonisms to the Ottomans to foster the Arab revolt in Mesopotamia. There had been uprisings in the shrine cities of the Middle Euphrates against conscription. How much British intelligence knew about that, I don't know, but we have good accounts of it now, and I worked it into my book. And we have a very interesting account about T.E. Lawrence by an Iraqi from Basra in Arabic. He talks about how he was interviewed by Lawrence and why he would not touch this mission of trying to promote rebellion against the Ottomans with a barge pole. But ultimately, Lawrence makes it to a meeting with Halil Pasha, where he tries to negotiate, but the surrender is already defended. It was on the day that the surrender had already been agreed. It was a fool's mission. I have no idea of the numbers of the Irish. It's easy enough to find out.
Ambassador answered.
Absolutely. And Shabia, the memorial in Bamako is absolutely fascinating, particularly as you say that there were Muslim soldiers from Mali fighting in Gallipoli because the British did redeploy.
The names were Muslim at least. I do not know whether they were Muslim.
Very few Christians give their kids the name Muhammad. So, it probably was the case. And, but the French and the British alike were very concerned about the loyalties of Muslim soldiers, particularly as they grew closer to the Khalifa's capital city. So that's I will look for photographs of that. Again, I thank you for the comment on Irish participation. And I think the same difficulty faced all colonized people in the later 20th century, how to do justice to the sacrifice of their soldiers in a colonial context. And the Irish, like the Arabs or the Algerians, are in that same position. But as you rightly note, the Irish suffered huge losses. And but it must be said, another one of my misconceptions, going against my Scottish upbringing, was that the largest single number of men involved from the United Kingdom were English. The largest number of, absolute number of dead were the English. So the cannon fodder myth too must be shattered. They were all cannon fodder. Mehmed's chicks and Tommy's alike. They were all just rode down by industrial war. I had no idea that David Lean's film had been banned in Turkey, but it is so surprising to me to this day to run into Turkish scholars or diplomats who still are fiercely betrayed by the Arab revolt. There's a real sense that the Arabs betrayed us. They stabbed us in the back.
It's the part of national education.
I guess, but it's 100 years later. And a lot's gone on since then. It surprises me that it still seems a nerve.
Also, it is present in the Turkish politics. I mean, the times of Mesopotamian Arabs and Turkey Arabs, you know, all these things, nothing evolving to Middle East. This is also the continuation.
But and it must be said, there are many things about which I can be critical about politics, but I think that the government has done at Turkish taxpayers' expense more good to Syrians who have fled their country's war than any of the neighboring countries. Whatever problem one wants to identify, and I can criticize, as I said, many things, but I think on this one area there's perhaps, you know, not holding against the Syrians here of the revolt.
But you know, in Turkish distinction, we have government and the state. That was the state approach.
But today, no problem, you can see this.
I can see I can take this into a very sensitive ground now. I will come to the last point, which was just the view that the Turks had about fellow Muslims on the other side of the battlefield. And there are a number of very interesting accounts from the Caucasus frontiers that preserved moments of fraternization between Muslims serving in the Russian army and Ottoman soldiers, and helping to protect them or cover them or hide them from capture or whatnot. There are a couple of accounts I found like that. And we know that a lot of colonial Muslims, when captured on the Western Front, found themselves target of recruitment to join the Ottoman army, and several thousand of them do. I found records of as many as 4,000 to 5,000 who were dispatched to the Iraqi and Iranian fronts. But they were never really assimilated into the Ottoman army with the confidence and trust that made them feel engaged on the Ottoman side of the war. My reading of the North African soldiers was that they fought on everybody's side of the war without doing anything for their own interest, and their morale was very low. I think that's all of the questions that, aside from your comments, and so I want to thank you for your wonderful questions.
Thanks ever so much, Eugene, for that. Thanks also for passing my PhD thesis a couple of years ago. That was, I'm still very grateful for that. There are going to be drinks now. For those of us coming tomorrow, we're not going to be in this room, we'll be upstairs, but people will be here to direct you. Thanks again for hosting, for helping organise. Thanks again for the British Embassy for helping with their promotion of the event and their sponsorship, and for Ambassador Moore for talking. Thanks to Osman Sandberg for his remarks. Thanks to everyone's questions for making such a great discussion, and I'd invite you to refresh yourselves upstairs with your choice of beverage.